Hello, everyone. My name is Yuro Zhong, Associate Professor at the Department of East Asian Studies, University of Toronto. On behalf of my co-organizers, Professor Gal Gavili from McGill University and Professor Anatoly Doubtweiler from University of Wisconsin-Madison, it is our distinct pleasure to welcome you to this special celebration of the 25th anniversary of Lydia Liu's translingual practice. Upon its initial publication, translingual practice was recognized as a landmark contribution to multiple fields such as modern Chinese literature, cultural history, comparative literature, translation studies, and post-colonial criticism. A generation later, it has become a must-read for these fields and continues to shape scholars working on China and beyond. We thank you for joining us commemorating translingual practice in its 25th year and celebrating its author, Professor Lydia Liu. Professor Liu is the Woon Song Tam Professor in the Humanities, Director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. After completing her PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University, she has taught at UC Berkeley and the University of Michigan before joining Columbia. A thinker of translation and media theory, a scholar of comparative literature, and a creative writer in Chinese, Professor Liu's research and publications have focused on the discursive mobility of ideas, texts, and artifacts across national boundaries, how different discourses and modes of representation circulate and acquire new meanings as well as legitimacy in different historical settings. She is a uniquely original thinker working across a wide-ranging field, extending from modern Chinese literature and comparative literature to translation studies and post-colonial criticism, from digital media and psychoanalysis to gender studies and international law. She is the author of Translingual Practice, Clash of Empires, Freudian Robot, and most recently, The Nesbit Code. Her articles have appeared in JAS, Critical Inquiry, PMLA, and Positions, among countless others. As a leading figure of our field, Professor Liu exemplifies the highest standards of research and writing and has consistently taught her students that it is always about doing the best work possible. In fact, when asked the preferred format of the Zoom celebration of translingual practice, Professor Liu replied that she'd rather that we did not emphasize the birth of translingual practice, but focus on our own work in loose connection with hers, so that collectively we could advance methodological and theoretical interventions since the publication of translingual practice and move the conversation forward. And that is exactly what we shall do. Together, we celebrate translingual practice in the hope of pushing for future work that would honor the rigor and heft it exemplifies. In doing the best work we can, we pay tribute to Lydia and her work. The format of the workshop is straightforward. 14 speakers list on the poster will each speak for no more than 10 minutes in an alphabetic order, with the exception of Professor Ari Heinrich presenting last due to time difference. We will take two 10-minute breaks at 3:20 and 4:30 p.m. At around 4:50, Professor Liu will give her final remarks, to be followed by questions and answers. Audience members are welcome to raise questions in the chat box throughout the event, which will be addressed during Q&A. The rundown of the workshop is pasted in the chat box for your reference. We thank University of Toronto, McGill University, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Columbia University, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute for their sponsorship. Once again, it is our tremendous honor to meet fellow readers of translingual practice in its 25th year, and we hope you enjoy this special occasion. I'll be your host for the first segment from now till 3:20 p.m. Our first speaker is David Bogenhion, a PhD candidate at Columbia University. He works on the ideal of the market in modern Chinese literature within the Southeast Asian context. David is also a veteran translator, art critic, and curator. David, the floor is yours.
Hi, so I'm very thankful to be here. It's a great honor. It's also completely embarrassing that I would be first. And of course, I think it's fitting that I'm first by accident, by the kind of accident of the placement of my name within the alphabet, considering that one of the things we're going to be talking about is, or considering that so much of Professor Liu's work has been about the sort of transformations and the contingencies involved in the creation of English as a modern language and Chinese as a modern language. So, you know, there were no A's in the group, so B puts me first. So I guess I did want to also mention that I'm very happy to be in this group of presenters because I found a lot of community with the other advisees that Lydia has worked with. And I want to specifically mention sort of the support that Myra, Anatoly, and Chloe have given me over time. Ben and Harlan were the ones who first met with me at Le Monde to try to convince me to join the program, not knowing that I had already made up my mind, but wanted the lunch. We talked about unionization, which is something that actually I was able to get involved with together with my colleagues and comrades, Joanna, Leah, and Sue, in my year or the years below me. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about the work of others who have just joined us recently, like Peter and Sam. And it's been really fulfilling to be able to do research and also to participate in movements for social change, including the Graduate Student Union, which is going strong at Columbia, and also to see politicization happening in forms like the tuition strike that's happening among undergrads, which is a call for social control of the university and the decommodification of education more generally. I'm also just really happy to be here with Tamara, Andrew, Ari, Yuro, Chenli, Gal Gavili, Shaden, Liansu, and Jing, all of whose work I admire, and many of whom I did not actually realize were former students of Lydia. So there's all these ways in which Lydia's work has sort of influenced me that I wasn't aware of. I'm going to talk specifically about, sorry, I'm going to put my timer on. Let's put it on. Okay, I'm going to talk specifically about the kind of relationship between the cultural and the economic, which is part of my interest, and also hopefully something that I would like to see develop further out of the research that happened in translingual practices, but also some of the later work around, for example, tokens of exchange, which is an edited volume from 1999. I'm going to kind of close on some remarks about diaspora and sort of why Southeast Asia is interesting to me. So to start, I guess I wanted to mention one of the chapters in Translingual Practice on reviewing this book. And a chapter that I wanted to review for a long time is the chapter on Lao She's Luo Xiangzi, which is a kind of advanced interpretation of Luo Xiangzi as a novel about sort of the construction and the pitfalls of the Homo economicus, and sort of reads the figure of Luo Xiangzi while also problematizing the kind of figural interpretation that book sort of compels the reader to do, in relation to the kind of long history of the novel as a form for describing, in like a kind of Robinson Crusoean way, the calculative rationality and the spirit of improvement, which are sort of advanced as a critical part of what makes capitalism function, or capitalist subjectivity. So in her reading of Luo Xiangzi, she focuses on how, because he can only sell his labor, his body becomes both alien to him and intimate to himself in a new way. So the body becomes fetishized like a commodity. And she does this through a kind of a discussion of the use of free and direct style, and the way that free and direct style, which is more ambiguous in her reading in Chinese grammar than in Indo-European languages, and is a kind of recent development within the context of 20th century Chinese, based in part on readings of European literature, how indirect style is deployed to create a sense of intimacy between Luo Xiangzi and his sort of his means of production, I guess, his body, but also specifically the fetishization, the attachment to the rickshaw. One of the things I found very interesting was that she points out how his fall, sort of his ruin, and the kind of inability to make good on the hopes of sort of the rags to riches narrative that he wants to perform, are catalyzed by his sexual experiences. So his body becomes something he can no longer contemplate with full self-assurance. And I think one thing to think about here is how there's a way in which sex in Luo Xiangzi is important because of how it is unproductive. It does not produce profit in the way that forms of labor through sort of rickshaw pulling are. And so I think there's a question here about social reproduction that could be really interesting to explore further, particularly in the due to the kind of decision of Lao She to write in Hu Niu's sort of end in the novel as sort of death in childbirth. So there's a kind of literal unproductiveness within the social reproduction fails in certain ways. Or let's say biological reproduction fails, but social reproduction continues in other ways, not in the form of the family, but in the form of the creation of possibly a kind of capitalist subject. And it's a little more ambiguous whether a collective proletarian subject does emerge. The idea of the Homo economicus is something that Anatoly Detweiler has also built on in his discussion of the Homo informaticus in Maldwin's or Midnight, in relation to the financial network, which is, I think, one of the most interesting expansions of that idea. But I also wanted to say that the kind of, I think our understanding of Homo economicus here, particularly in relation to how tied it is to capitalist subjectivity and calculated rationality, is perhaps too reliant on a kind of Weberian idea of the importance of culture towards capitalism. And one of my challenges, or one of the things that I would like to see, is what does a line of research that comes out of this kind of description of Homo economicus within the novel look like when we attend more to the material conditions, or let's say the economic categories of whether they're material or symbolic that develop within these novels. So one of the things I'm interested in, for example, is how the rickshaw is a form of capital. So when we think about the transformation of the body in relation to his incorporation of capital, or his desire to become one with the rickshaw, what line of reasoning would that take us down? One other thing I noticed in rereading this was that in this reading, Professor Liu recapitulates a distinction between the pre-capitalist and the capitalist. And that's something that I think we also can problematize at this point, sort of with all the recent work that's been done around the history of capitalism. So I'm going to skip ahead now to one thing I wanted to say, which is I think there's also a lot of space for translingual practices to be expanded in relationship to Southeast Asia. Our field has a very strong orientation towards Japan and towards Europe and North America. And I think this has a lot to do with the ways that, with who emigrated where and why. And social science has done a lot with the Southeast Asian Chinese diaspora, but the humanities haven't. And I think that has everything to do with the way the Southeast Asian Chinese were racialized as economic rather than cultural, so economic objects rather than cultural subjects. I think of the fact, for example, that Luthiel conspicuously avoids the term Kuli, or Kuli, which would have sort of has a genealogy through South Asia and Southeast Asian British imperial colonies. And I think also of how there's a kind of massive, everyone loves the appendixes for translingual practice. I love these appendices. And I think of how interesting it would be to think about the role of Chinese in the transformation of languages like Indonesian, where we have terms like, the term 公司, for example, in Indonesian means to share. So what's the kind of genealogy for that? And what are the transformations that have happened there? Indonesia is one of the few places where China is referred to as Tiongkok, which is a Hokkien term for, for Zhongguo. So where does that come from, right? This is one of the few, and that has everything to do with political history, when compared to Malay, where the term is China. So, I mean, just to conclude then, I guess one thing I'm really interested in is, if Professor Liu's interests in the debates on individualism, national culture, and revolution, in her own words in the preface and introduction, have everything to do with her growing up in the Cultural Revolution. And what I want to know is what, for those of us who grew up in kind of the neoliberal era, sort of post-reform and opening, how are we going to advance those discussions in integrating kind of histories of capitalism, social reproduction theory, discussions of racial capitalism, to kind of explain the neoliberal hellscape that we live in, and to figure out what kinds of equivalence and differences matter in this moment. And I think this has everything to do, and for me personally, this has everything to do with what happens to the south of China, so the diasporic creation of nationalism and other forms of kind of diverse forms of capitalism. And I think with that, I'll just close. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Right on time. 1 minute earlier, actually. Thank you. So our next speaker is Harlan Chambers. He's a PhD candidate at Columbia University. He researches on the Chinese agrarian world from land reform of the 1940s all the way to the Great Leap Forward. Harlan is also a former actor in Paris. Harlan has an avid interest in theater and other forms of live performances. Harlan, take away.
They're talking or not? No, hello. They're waiting.
Hello. Thank you so much, Uro, Gal, and Anatoly, for inviting me and for organizing this. Congratulations, Professor Liu, on the 25-year anniversary I was like so excited when I got the invitation to say something today, because this book meant a lot to me. I don't think that's a particularly original thing to say today, but well, it did. And I don't know if I'm going to break the mold of scholarship in these 10 minutes per se, but I really enjoyed rereading this book and just wanted to raise a few questions that came along with the rereading. And the first one is how to think this practice of translingual practice. Do we designate practitioners, say? The literary thinkers in the study, Lu Xun, the Dinglings, the Xiaohongs, are they translingual practitioners? Or does translingual practice indicate a historical process that articulates not only qualitative changes at the level of language, but epistemological transformations? And then the question would not be so simple as practitioner, non-practitioner, but what kind of consciousness one articulates towards the very conditions of thinking in guises of practice or in forms of practice. And so these were questions that came up for me rereading this time, particularly in chapters which focus on literary works. And Professor Liu's study works at times with granular attention to literary form and its possible effects, and suggests to me that literary writing can bear a kind of intentional critical engagement, not with a theory of translingual practice per se, but with how to think the historical contradictions of its time. And the authors under Liu's critical eye are not just these passively producing the people passively producing literary demonstrations of their historical situation. It's literary expression which presents the work, it carves out its own conditions for reflection. And a great example of this for me is the concluding chapter from chapter 2, Study on Lu Xun's AQ, where, of course, Liu argues Lu Xun radically rewrites Arthur Smith's missionary discourse, not just through storytelling, but narrative form. David talked a bit about this importance of narrative form as well. And what really struck me in the conclusion, though, is how Liu phrases Lu Xun's literary craft. Lu Xun is, and I'll quote this, cutting out a subject position in the fabric of the story. Quote, I love this. It's like this tactile evocation of narration. It's like working with textile. And it suggests that the author has this potential to act. But what does it mean to act through literary practice? This is something that obviously concerned Lu Xun, that concerns, I think, a lot of us. Is the most meaningful act a political act, a political critique? And I think a key question of Liu's study is not understanding the object of an author's critique, clarifying it, but it's also the form of the critique. Literary expression as a form of critique is carefully considered. And this is particularly true in the translingual modes of representation section of the book. And it leads me to ask, what is the significance of the relationship between cultural practice, notably literary practice, and translingual practice? Is there something about cultural creation in general, and the literary medium in particular, which facilitates interventions into translingual practice? So in the chapter Narratives of Desire, for example, Liu argues, and I'll quote again, there are Chinese writers and critics who have made self-conscious attempts to establish a translingual relationship between Chinese fiction and Freudianism, end quote. So what attracts me here is how this argument poses the question of consciousness. Do cultural mediums offer distinct possibilities to engage the problem of consciousness amidst the transformations enacted by translingual practice? And this brings me back to reading literary form and how it enacts critique. To the extent that we understand such critiques in literature, in their relation to translingual practice as being political, Lydia Liu makes clear that this is a politics which cannot readily be discerned by some kind of simple historical or biographical reading. It's not a politics set in those terms per se. And I will follow David's lead in taking up Lao's Luo Tuo Xiangzi, where Liu argues that this novel stages this irresolvable contradiction between, on the one hand, notions of, or a notion of individualism, and on the other, the collective, advocating in a way for both, or being interpretable as both, advocating for both. And she says, quote, "Perhaps the point of the novel is precisely to demand and resist interpretation in the very act of interpretation," end quote. I love that sentence. It's such a great reading. So if we speak of the political of Lao's novel, it is not to simply advocate for historically extant notions of, say, the individual or the collective, not to indulge in the banality of dissent against the politics of such and such. Rather, the political is in how the novel stages the dilemma of having to choose in the first place. It's a certain political logic of either or. And in this regard, could we say that literary practice and the medium of literary prose permits coming into consciousness about fundamental conditions of the political through the experiences it produces? Is this then a question of the effects of literary form, which Liu's study teases out? By producing works with such potential effects, are these literary thinkers engaging in the dynamics of translingual practice? Finally, there's one particular effect I would like to conclude on, and that is the effect of the unwritten. You know, I've encountered scholarly engagements with this book over the years. They often present translingual practice principally as a question of neologisms, loanwords, return graphic loans, transliterations, etc. Understandably, they're so meticulously presented in the book's 7 appendices. Yet this time, rereading it, what really struck me was that in addition, and maybe I should say a necessary supplement to the historical production of certain neologisms, etc. words, there's also attention to the unwritten. This is vividly articulated in Liu's discussion of gender and nationalism. Gender is posed as an unmarked condition in so much discursive practice. And, you know, I would say that in translingual practice, the engagement with Xiaohong, as well as more recent collaborative scholarship on He Yingzhen, seeks precisely to render this unmarked condition marked. And in a willfully absurd moment, as I was reading this, I wondered, would it be possible to add another appendix to this study, an appendix of the unmarked, these produced silences which unfold through historical processes of translingual practice? But what would such an appendix even look like? Or I guess are the very organizing principles of a neatly delineated catalog antithetical to the kind of interpretive labor necessary to even grasp at the contours of the unmarked in the first place? Is it once again in practices of reading and writing, of literary reflection and critique, that the unmarked can be made visible? Could we then say that the possibility of engaging as critical practitioners in the field of translingual practice is a question not strictly of grappling with various forms of language, but its unmarked silent contours? That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harlan, very much. Our third speaker is Professor Li Chen. Professor Chen is an associate professor of History and Global Asia Studies at the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies, UTSC, Graduate Department of History and Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Chinese Law in Imperial Eyes, Sovereignty, Justice, and Transcultural Politics, which is the recipient of the 2018 Levinson Book Prize in the pre-1900 category. Professor Chen.
Thank you very much, Yuzo, and also for all the other organizers for inviting me to be here. I certainly feel not just honored, actually flattered to be part of this group to join the celebration of Professor Liu's wonderful book. And as many of you know, I might be, one of the few panelists who are not officially former students of Professor Liu. So I feel somehow to be an imposter here. But also I do count myself as one of those who have tremendously benefited from Professor Liu's work. So certainly it's a great opportunity for me to be part of this celebration, but also to acknowledge my gratitude to Professor Liu's contribution to the field, not just the influence on my work, but also her contribution to multiple fields. I have recently conducted an interview, 3-hour-long interview with Professor Liu to discuss her scholarship, but also the various kinds of ways her works have influenced many, many fields. Since we have a lot of colleagues and also friends who can offer much more firsthand experience and observations, and also much more insightful comments on Professor Liu's scholarly work and contributions. And given the limited time, Yuzo and I have agreed that I will limit my comments to much shorter length. So I will try to limit my comments actually to 1 page. Instead of offering more, it is sophisticated things which I don't have the capacity to do, I will just highlight a few things from my own experience and also my own work to offer some kind of echo or confirmation of what my co-panelists have said or may say later. Hopefully that will save some time for others to hear, to offer their insights. As a historian and post-colonial scholar of late imperial modern China, I particularly appreciate Professor Liu's multidisciplinary scholarship and also in many ways her pioneering interventions into various disciplines and very important scholarly debates, particularly in relation to modern China or modern Chinese history. From what I can tell, these important contributions will certainly include her timely and very valuable interventions into the recent historical scholarship on modern China and its relationship with the Western countries, as seen not just in her translingual practice, but also her Clash of Empires and other works. Her theoretical insights on translingual practice and politics through the book that we are celebrating today has certainly very importantly transformed a lot of the important debates on modern or early modern Sino-Western relations. I will just use my own first monograph to illustrate. My book was published in 2016, so that's a few years ago. But in the book, I have 1.5 chapters devoted to studying the English translation of Qing Dynasty's law code, Qing Ruili, in 1810, and its retranslation into French, Italian, Spanish, and other languages later on. I studied not just the process of translation or cultural translation, but also the power politics involved in the deterritorialization and then reterritorialization of the Chinese law code of the Qing dynasty into European languages. And in the process, I also tried to study how the cultural assumptions, ideological and epistemological discourses were involved in shaping that process. I investigated the struggles and epistemic anxieties that the translators and their commentators as well as their interlocutors had to go through in the process of trying to construct the so-called equivalences between the Chinese legal concepts, the Chinese legal traditions and cultural traditions, and their supposed European or Western counterparts. I also analyzed how new vocabulary, new concepts, and new images, as well as new discourses about the Chinese legal and cultural as well as political traditions, and by extension, Chinese civilization in the process, and how those kinds of new images and new discourses were constructed and then politicized as well as institutionalized in the process of Sino-Western encounters in the 1819 early 20th centuries. So to put it in a different way, much of the analysis in those 1.5 chapters were very directly impacted and informed by Professor Liu's various kinds of insightful ideas and also conceptual insights in her book, Translingual Practice, as well as her later book, Clash of Empires. So this goes back to one of the things that I consider to be, I think, one of the most important contributions of Professor Liu's translingual practice. That is, the book hammers home effectively and also powerfully the fact that so-called translation between Chinese and Western languages involved not just trying to identify linguistic or conceptual equivalence, but rather, at least from my perspective, I understand now translation should be a process and also one of the very important sites in which power politics and also power negotiations took place or are still continuing to take place between languages, narratives, cultural, ideological, and epistemological systems. So based on the interview I have recently conducted with Professor Liu, certainly I understand that she's continuing to do a lot of the work along some of the concepts we have just mentioned, and we will continue to discuss throughout this event. Some of the other interventions she has made are related to, for example, the recent and also very important developments in the field of international law or the history, critical studies especially of international law. And for modern China historians, her study of the so-called super sign of Yi or barbarian, the translation involved in that process between Chinese Yi and English or European language, barbarian and so on. Certainly has already impacted on some of the more recent scholarship on modern Chinese history and also history of modern Sino-Western relations and so on. One of the questions actually I would like to hear from Professor Liu or other colleagues here is to what extent her discussion in the book Translingual Practice, which focused on especially translingual, that means necessarily languages and also the textual translation, to what extent those insights can be applied, at least with some equal efficacy, to the process of emotional or sentimental practices and so on. So if we have time, I definitely would like to hear more about that.
Okay, our next speaker is Professor Tamara Ching, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and East Asian Studies at Brown University. She works on comparative approaches to the ancient world and to historical narrative with a focus on early Chinese texts, the Afro-Eurasian Silk Road, and the modern politics of antiquity. Her first book, Savage Exchange, Han Imperialism, Chinese Literary Style, and the Economic Imagination, received the ACLA Harry Levine Prize, among many other accolades. Professor Ching.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, just to say thank you very much to Euro, Gal, and Anatoly for organizing this. When I first met Lydia 22 years ago, I was studying ancient Greek, and it's really thanks to her and her teaching and her work that I managed to make a shift. And I'd like to talk for the next 8 minutes really about my work, but about one feature of translingual practice that inspired it, that's already come up, and that has to do with the different kinds of loanwords that transformed modern Chinese. Translingual practice has been hugely generative in redirecting our attention from word roots to word routes, and I'll try to show the particular significance of this shift in the modern study of ancient language contact. Classical Chinese loanwords were on a much smaller scale, and I'll give a brief sketch of when and how these smaller scale ancient loanwords became meaningful for modern scholars. And I'll argue that China's participation in the first Afro-Asian conference in Bandung in 1955 marks an important shift in approaches to ancient loans. Loanwords and language contact had a limited significance in European comparative philology, broadly put. The analysis of word roots and their inflection and derivation dominated the classification of languages into ethnic linguistic families. When William Jones discovered the kinship between Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, and Latin, he based etymology on cognates, not loanwords. And in the case of Persian, quote, "I find no trace of any Arabian tongue except what proceeded from the known intercourse between the Persians and the Arabs." Loanwords were part of this known intercourse. They were part of what linguists like Saussure would call the external elements of language, important but not vital in the way that grammar and the internal life of language was. This division of language families, Semitic, Indo-European, Chinese, Sanskrit, on the basis of cognate word roots, became blurred in one context that I'll talk about briefly. In the 19th century study, what was then called Indo-Chinese languages. colonial administrators in the so-called primitive hinterland frontiers of northern India, southern China, Southeast Asia, far away from Sanskrit and Mandarin Chinese, started making vocabulary lists that weren't always clear about whether similarities were due to genetic relations or extensive historical loans. For example, was the word guy or cow from the Sanskrit gao or the Chinese niu? Was the local word for dog derived from the Chinese go or the Sanskrit kukura? As you can see here, in this context, lists of loanwords appeared almost as an unintended effect of this primary pursuit of cognates. Some positive interest in ancient loanwords did, however, appear in traditional and modern philology. Very briefly, Confucian philology traditionally primarily focused on Chinese language texts, but long lists of ancient loanwords did appear at the end of the standard histories of the Liao, Diang, and Yuan dynasties. Manchu Ting scholars renewed interest in ancient loanwords from the so-called alien dynasties from Inner Asia, so Khitan, Jurchen, Mongolian languages. And in Buddhist studies, Japanese, Chinese, and Western scholars began to produce dictionaries of first millennium Chinese loans from Sanskrit that were on a much larger scale. Finally, around 1900, the famous discoveries in Dunhuang and Northwest China revolutionized interest in ancient loans. The Dunhuang archive made the, quote briefly here, the incessant to and fro of travelers and pilgrims made a to and fro between Indo-European, Semitic, Turkic, Sino-Tibetan languages more important, especially in phonology. As put in this manifesto here, it called for Indianists to become sinologists and sinologists to become Indianists. The Bandung Conference re-signified this pre-existing study of historical loanwords, and it made pre-colonial Afro-Asian connections a historical precedent to post-colonial Afro-Asian solidarity. I'll look at very briefly, both Ji Xianlin and Ma Jian helped to develop Asia-Africa studies at Peking universities, and Prabodh Bagchi ran the China Center at Tagore's Visvabharati University in Calcutta. One of the most celebrated discoveries from Northwest China was initially that of two hitherto unknown Indo-European languages called Tocharian A and Tocharian B. Ji Xianlin had spent a decade in Germany studying with one of its decipherers, Emil Sieg. Tocharian's roots or genealogy came as a shock. Although found in China, the study of Tocharian roots and cognates showed that it was genetically belonged to the Indo-Europeans' Western branch, that's Greek and Latin, instead of its Eastern branch, Sanskrit and Persian. And amid the rise of racialized linguistics, debates before Bandung centered on the racial affiliation of the Tocharian speakers, their blue eyes, their red hair, instead of its, as opposed to its, and its potential influence on Chinese civilization. After Bandung, Ji Xianlin turned the spotlight from cognates to loanwords, from Tocharian's genetic relationship to Greek to Tocharian's Silk Road history with Chinese. He showed that some Chinese loanwords came first from Tocharian and only later from Sanskrit, and the study of Tocharian was thus for him a bridge in the history of China-India relations. Part of Ji's post-colonial critique was that Indo-European and Dunhuang philology had focused too much on outside influence on Chinese, and he actively pursued the two-way or multi-way traffic in words and things. For example, he looked both at the Chinese loanword for Indian silk and the Sanskrit word for Chinese silk. Now, this model of two-way traffic drew in part on the work of the Indian philologist P.C. Bagchi, who founded the journal in Sino-Indian Studies. And if you take Bagchi's first book on medieval Chinese Sanskrit lexicons, the Chinese word for paper in the second large row, as Bagchi explained, paper had not reached India at this time, and the Sanskrit term for paper, shaya, is a loanword from the Chinese zhi. For the medieval Chinese learner of Sanskrit, the lexicon also contains the Chinese the Chinese pronunciation of the Sanskrit term shaya, here sheya. So you have the Chinese imitation of the Sanskrit imitation of the Chinese. And this echo chamber of equivalence is part of what Bagchi called the Serindian, China-India inspiration. And the Sino-Indian Studies Journal became a showcase of this two-way ancient relationship that the diplomacy of Nehru and Zhou Enlai sought to renew. Finally, and this is where I'll end, Ma Jian was educated in Cairo in the 1930s and drew on a different tradition of anti-Eurocentric scholarship. He published several articles on the two-way traffic of medieval Arabic and Chinese loanwords, as you can see on the left in red. And on the right, Ma Jian proposed a change in 1963 to the Chinese dictionary. The current word for olive, ganlan, should henceforth be zitun, a phonetic loan from its Arabic equivalent zaytun, excuse my pronunciation. This new loanword, zitun, will become a memorial to the history of friendly interactions and cultural exchange between China and Arab countries, because A, the earliest 9th century Chinese term for the imported olive had already been a loan from the Arabic zaytun, written then as zitun, and B, medieval Arab traders had also used this same word zaytun as a loanword for China's then biggest port city of Zitong, nowadays Quanzhou. From Zitong, Arab traders ferried zaytuni or satin into English and other European languages. Thus, unlike the modern Chinese loanword list from European and Japanese languages that enter Chinese often as tokens of the unequal conditions that Lydia's work has demonstrated, the pre-modern loanword became, at least during that experimental Bandung moment, a symbolic token of China's pre-colonial solidarity with Afro-Asian countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ching, for teaching us much about the Korean studies and Sino-Indian translingual practice and solidarity. Great. Well, our next speaker is our co-organizer, Professor Anatoly Dautweiler, assistant professor at University of Wisconsin Madison. He works on modern Chinese literature and history, comparative new media, and information studies. Two of his edited volumes are forthcoming. The first, Information, a Reader, and the second, Literary Information in China. He is also working on his first book, The Aesthetics of Information in Modern Chinese Literary Culture, Professor Dautweiler.
Let me just make sure that I'm not muted. You can hear me, right? And see my screen?
Yes. And
great,
yes.
Thanks. I'm not teaching this semester, so I'm still sort of getting used to the Zoom environment. Thank you, Yuro, and thanks, Gal, for co-organizing this event with me. And especially thank you to everybody else for joining us in the conversation this afternoon. Today, I want to spend my 10 minutes paying homage to translingual practice by discussing and expanding upon an important observation in the book that regards the role of abstraction in the fantasies and practices of translation. As we're all intimately familiar with, the book really changed the terms by which we understand translation, insisting against the conventional view of translation as an abstract game of identifying hypothetical equivalences between two languages, and instead making us take translation as something that is historically grounded. Lydia has this memorable moment where she says, oftentimes translation happens at gunpoint, quite literally. So historically grounded, shaped by contextual concerns and relations of power, and then oftentimes bearing back upon these relations of power and concerns. What I find really useful here is that in arguing against the conceit of abstraction that underlies this concept of innate translingual commensurability, the book also historicizes the subject of abstraction itself, showing us a lot of different moments where a kind of third space is imagined as the staging ground for words or concepts where from two different systems to meet one another. So one of the prominent examples given here is that of the Bilingual Dictionary, which is a kind of common space It's quintessentially, but not exclusively modern. And then it becomes this real visible space of abstraction. One that is by no means simple. I mean, it really demonstrates the complexity and the kind of multivalence of translingual practice itself, and then the filter that it provides for the experience and logic of modernity more broadly. So this step towards historicizing abstraction invites further consideration of other contemporary forms of abstraction in order to better understand the processes by which individuality and collective subjectivities were transformed during the period. I have in mind a specific example, that of datafication of writing and text that occurred in the 1920s that I'm drawing from my own book project. The case of datafication offers us an encounter that, like translingual practice, draws equivalences between two symbolic systems. But here, only one of the systems is linguistic, while the other is numerical, statistical, or graphical representation. I mean, I'm taking datafication to actually kind of mean all three things: numbers, statistical analysis, and then visual representation as graphics. We're not talking about translation here, in other words, but rather we are nonetheless talking about a very significant process of transformation that I think in many ways parallels that of translingual practice per se. So my favorite example, let me see, okay, comes from one of the most famous reformist intellectuals of the early 20th century, Yang Qichao, who in 1922 proposed a new method of scholarship called statistical historiography, 统计历史学, which entailed first mining China's vast historical record for singular facts like places or personages or whatever, and then analyzing these facts at scale in order to tap into what we might think of as a kind of statistical unconsciousness of the text, and to thereby produce new historical facts that we wouldn't otherwise get through the kind of individual experience of reading. Liang didn't live long enough to really go through with the project, but his student at Tsinghua, Wei Juxian, subsequently expanded on the method and published a book and some articles on it, going so far as to provide readers with an index card template that I'm showing you here for noting observations within a text. Basically, I've schematized the method as such. It's a process of refining or cooking the raw data, and I'm putting this in quotation marks because raw data is an oxymoron, Lisa Gittleman teaches us, where observations are organized using a biao or a table, then enumerated, and then finally rendered into tu or diagrams and graphs, which will reveal patterns. So you can kind of see here what these stages actually look like. The example of historical statistics is relatively minor, but it's also interesting, I think, because it's representative of the very widespread adoption of information graphics in the print culture of the 1920s and the 1930s. So like bilingual dictionaries, these data images that I'm showing you here are kind of commensurability machines that rely on and enforce the utility of the abstraction space. The tu and the biao, I think, are particularly interesting because quite a bit like literature, which some others have already talked about as a place for translingual practice and reflecting on it, these graphics oftentimes have the capacity to reflect back onto their own operation and their own kind of historical conditions, performing equivalence by placing different elements onto the same plane of commensurability to be compared and contrasted, but at the same time kind of think in some examples actually thinking critically about what it means to level everything into one single unified abstract plane. In a moment, I'll show an example of that. before I do that, I do want to just pause and observe that the words involved here, the biao and the tu, are themselves integral examples of translingual practice. Because these are single character words that were adapted from classical Chinese, where they corresponded with a rich tradition of graphic forms that in the 1920s also came to name the graphic forms being adopted from the West. So here in the lower right corner, these are kind of what we would identify as Western or modern graphical forms. But the middle biao here is actually something that we would not be surprised to encounter in a much older text. So this transition in meaning creates a kind of appearance of historical continuity and formal equivalence, and I think a sense of ambiguity in meaning, one which was not lost on those who were promoting it. I'm thinking here of Liang Qichao and Wei Juxian, who were kind of famously syncretic in their beliefs. They did not seek a clean break with the past, but instead wanted to kind of draw on the Chinese tradition as a source of intellectual value and national identity. And then ultimately they wanted to not just suggest that you could use data to understand the past, but that China has a past and a history of data itself, a kind of revisionist approach, which makes sense, I think, when we look back at earlier instantiations of biao from the Shiji, or this kind of more recent one from Gu Donggao's work in the Ching, this piece of evidentiary scholarship on a classical text. So these very much look like kind of data frames or something along those lines. But the difference, of course, between this and a modern space of hyper abstraction is enumeration, is this kind of extra dimension of numeric abstraction, which then allows us to get into kind of statistical world and really levels things much more radically, such that rather than just kind of comparing events and putting them into a homogenized temporal plane, we can compare things like narrative attention here, as Wei Juxian does in addressing the Chunqiu and the Zhuozhuan and the kind of ratios of narrative attention that they pay to certain things. I'm sorry, I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because I want to wrap up in the next minute and a half. So, so far I've discussed the datafication of texts in a single language in Chinese, but the method was also used for transcultural comparison and criticism, as this, my last example, illustrates. What you're looking at here comes from a 1924 publication by the psychologist Zhang Yaoxiang, titled On the Sentiment of New Poets, in which he counted exclamation points in modern vernacular Chinese poetry, and then compared the scores with Western counterparts. This is, I think, fascinating because this actually looks like an instance of translingual practice, but it's an equivalence that doesn't entail direct translation at all, and instead is mediated through data and the conceits of datafication. So let me just conclude here with a key point from translingual practice. I think we're all very intimately familiar with this argument that the crossing of analytical categories over language boundaries, like any other crossing or transgression, is bound to entail confrontations charged with contentious claims to power. We have to kind of think about the power, in other words. And just note that datafication too is really not an innocent exercise in possibility, but rather is completely bound up in questions of power at every stage of its becoming. So beginning simply with the conception and project design, which are drawing inspiration from modern aspects of biopolitics like population management and eugenics, to the production of data itself, which removes elements from their original context and then makes them kind of measurable categories or features. And so Zhang actually depicts this for us using a metaphorical biao that illustrates how the biao itself sees a work of new poetry. He takes this poem by Guomo Ruo, and he actually transforms it into this, where what is only recognizable now is the emptied infrastructure of a text that bears little further meaning than a pattern of punctuation marks. So there's a kind of violence being enacted here on the text itself. Finally, oops, I want to, now I'm not sure. Okay, finally, there is the trace of power in the visual consumption of statistical output, where one very much sees a text or corpus as a state sees its subjects and its population. And here there's a sense of epistemological mastery, where one transcends the limitations of being an individual reader and instead can take in a larger landscape in a single synoptic glance. A kind of mastery which is very much a source of pleasure for the practitioner of datafication. I'm going to give you this example here in the shape of a poem by Zhang Yaoxiang that commemorates his own experience of looking upon the biao that he has created. And this will be my last word here, something I'm sharing as a kind of relic of, a very strange relic of the early age of hyper-abstraction that translingual practice has brought us to. So the poem reads, "Seen from below, it resembles a spring rain, while seen from above, it looks like numerous wheat fields. Shrunk down, they're like numerous bacteria, while close up, they appear as several rows of bullets." Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Detweiler. Poetry is forever changed. Okay, we're 2 minutes late. Let's move on to our next speaker, co-organizer, Professor Gal Gavili, assistant professor at McGill University. Her research interests include China-India literary relations in the modern era, literary theory, post-colonial criticism, gender studies, and religion studies. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in JAS, Religions, Comparative Literature Studies, among others. She is working on her first book, Decolonizing Literature, Imagining India in Modern China. Gal.
Okay, unmute. So everyone can hear me, right? Okay, good. I have to say that though I turned off my my messages and everything, something kind of popped up 2 minutes ago. So I don't know, I may have done it incorrectly, and I apologize in advance if that's the case. I wanted to thank you, Rowan Anatoly, for you know, for initiating this and for all of us putting this together. I first met Lydia 15 years ago in a very sort of unplanned, serendipitous event as a first-year MA student at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I was contacted by a professor in comparative literature studies who asked me to go to the airport and pick up a very well-known professor of modern Chinese literature and comparative literature, Lydia Liu. And I knew the name, of course, because I have read Translingual Practice for my BA, but I was, you know, as you can imagine, very daunted and did not quite understand what exactly am I going to do in that meeting. However, from that meeting and from the conversation, Lydia has decided to take a chance on me 2 years later. And for that, I am forever grateful. I'm also happy to go right after Anatoly and Tamara, because I think that my presentation here is going to connect quite well with Tamara's study of Sino-Indian linguistics and with Anatoly's focus on translation and the dynamic of history, particularly in the last very powerful quotation from Translingual Practice that Anatoly brought up. Okay, so I'll start here. One of the most important contributions of the concept translingual practice, as Anatoly just mentioned and Li Chen mentioned as well, is manifested in the way in which the act of translation becomes a dynamic of history. Lydia Liu's debunking of the idea that words can move between languages in the same way that a dictionary conjures a false sense of commensurability, enables us still to think about translation as an event or a series of events that, when we think about recent history of acts of translation, beckons us to expose and detail the inner workings of imperialist meaning making. I'm thinking about this eventfulness of translation, as goes the title of another one of Lydia Liu's articles from 2014 in my research, in my recent research, where I try and raise the question, what happens when a modern bilateral exchange between two cultures of the global South, in my case, China and India, is mediated by a third language, the language of the colonizer? China re-encountered India as a result of the Anglo-European imperial expansion in Asia that culminated in the Opium War. New maritime routes, which linked Calcutta, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, transmitted information about India to China, usually through English language textbooks, often composed and translated to Chinese by Protestant missionaries. In the book that I'm writing, I examine the role of English in mediating the modern China-India encounter and what this mediation entailed for Chinese literary poetics of decolonization. In the short time that I have today, I want to focus on just one example from the well-known Buddhist writer and translator Su Manshu, whose awareness of the mediating agency of English in China-India interaction led him to devise a theory of translation in the first decade of the 20th century. And this is what I called here translations as literary relations. Okay. So Su Manshu was born in 1884 in Yokohama, Japan, to a Chinese father and a Japanese mother. He spent the first decade of the 20th century residing intermittently in Japan and traveling to South and Southeast Asia often. There, he also studied Sanskrit in Bangkok in a very well-known monastery with a very well-known teacher. Now, Su Manshu is celebrated as an inventor of the modern male subjectivity in Chinese literature and for his pioneering use of first-person voice. He's known as the sentimentalist, the pioneering sentimentalist. Less attention had been paid to his identity as a translator or to the role Buddhism, the study of Sanskrit, or the history of India's anti-colonial resistance played in shaping Su Manshu's fiction and literary criticism. Versed in Chinese, Japanese, English, and Sanskrit, Su was one of the first translators of European and Indian literatures to Chinese at a time period which, as Michael Hill has shown us, translation not only became a profession, but also intervened in the historical context in which it operated. Su Manshu's fiction and poetry often present a tapestry of languages, with Sanskrit, Chinese, and English words appearing together in different scripts or in transliteration. Often, Su used translated poems as part of dialogue in his stories and novellas, both his translation and others. Far from indexing a cosmopolitanist approach of a globetrotter romanticist, as Su had been studied, the translingualism of his writings, I argue, bespeaks a view of translation work as a practice that shines light on power imbalances and contemporary geopolitics. His study of and translation from Sanskrit, for example, underscored not only deep commitment to Buddhist revivalism, but also to India's anti-colonial struggle, which he promoted in several solidarity societies in which he was a member in Tokyo. In the book chapter from which I draw this presentation here, I discuss Su Manshu's editorial practices, his composition of an 8-volume work on Sanskrit grammar, and his fiction. Today, I will give just one example that I hope will tease out some of his ideas on the meaning of translation work in his day. So in 1908, Su edited and published an anthology he titled Literary Relations, 文学音乐. Published by a publishing house in Fujian through a friend that he had who was gracious enough to agree to invest some money in this. This anthology that he composed paired English translations of Chinese classics done by British and American missionaries and diplomats, such as James Legge, Herbert A. Giles, and George T. Candlin, with translations of to Chinese of poems by Byron and other English romanticists, made by him and his colleagues. To these, Su added a translation that he did from English of a well-known epigram that Goethe wrote to celebrate the Sanskrit drama Shakuntala, a 15th century classic that during the 19th century became one of the first global bestsellers across Europe. The juxtaposition of English language translations of Chinese classical poetry with Chinese translations of English poetry invokes one type of literary relations or connections between the crown jewels of Chinese literature, tongue poetry, and the Shijing, and milestone English Romanticism. The inclusion in this anthology of Goethe's epigram, however, is curious. What is an indirect translation from English of a German text about an Indian drama doing in a Chinese, English, English-Chinese anthology? One could make the case that Goethe meshes well with the romantic inclination of the British section of the anthology. Yet, by retranslating an epigram written to commemorate a Sanskrit drama, in which, as Su Manchu knew very well, speaks for German 19th century fascination with India in general and with Sanskrit theater in particular, Su does more than showcasing romantic literature. In this editorial choice, Su opened up the meaning of literary relations, which gives this anthology its title, to include, along with the Ching and the British empires, India, represented by the celebrated Sanskrit drama in retranslation. The preface that he wrote to this anthology makes this move apparent. The preface, which is very short, 3 pages, veers with no transitions from discussing the contents of the anthology and biographic information about the various translators to lengthy passages about Sanskrit language and masterpieces of Indian culture. So, for example, sentences such as, okay, here we go. Sentences such as James Legge translated the Book of Odes in full are immediately followed by, of all the languages of the world, none matches Sanskrit in beauty. So there's kind of a disconnect there. Su continues, he discusses Byron and then transitions to discuss the contents of the classical epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Without any perceived relation to the content of the anthology which he is prefacing, the preface concludes with a vignette recollecting a boat trip at sunset after visiting the ruins of an ancient pagoda in Sri Lanka, in which Su cites from one of his own poems. The logic behind the narrative disconnects Su embeds in the preface, a logic that inserts physically discussions on India and Sanskrit repeatedly into a debate over Chinese English and English Chinese translation, reveals a particular understanding of the translation act. The title of the collection gives us a clue. It situates literary relations between not 2, but more than 3 languages, Chinese, English, Sanskrit, and German. These languages had been bounded together in recent history because of Western imperialism. Now, of course, this term Inyuan had become a cliched trope, but it's worth thinking about its original meaning, especially in light of Su Manchu's life path as a Buddhist monk. Inyuan is a Buddhist term that denotes the idea of causes in and conditions, yuan, of a certain outcome, and indexes as such the Buddhist central idea of karma, a chain of events where one impacts the creation of another. The title, Literary Relations, thus invokes a particular understanding of translation, understood as a chain of events that are connected by cause and effect. The appearance of Sanskrit and Indian scenery in the preface asserts literary relations between Chinese and English literatures are bound to extend to India because of its colonization by England, which in turn shaped China's encounter with the British Empire. Follow the translingual translation path of such works as Shakuntala, Su seems to be saying, from India to Germany, to England, and to China, because translation is enabled by and creates literary relations and relations of power in a broad sense, a chain of causes and results that shapes history, and in it, it shapes what gets translated and how. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gavili. Thank you for introducing us to the modern leg of Sino-Indian translingual practice. Our last speaker for the first segment is Professor Michael Gibbs Hill, Associate Chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures and Director of Chinese Studies at William and Mary. He works on the literary and intellectual history of China in the 19th and 20th centuries, the history of translation and cultural relations between China and the Middle East. He's the author of Lingshu Inc. and his new book, Chinese and Arabic Literatures at the End of Empire, 1850 to 1950, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Professor Hill.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure you can view this. I wouldn't say the book is forthcoming. It's forthcoming a long time from now. Hopefully it'll be wrapped up maybe by the end of the next calendar year. Thank you all so much for organizing this. I also wanted to show off my copy of Translingual Practice, purchased in 1999, very well worn, lots of notes, stickies, all these kinds of things. And as I was rereading and kind of re-engaging with the book that I've referred to so many times, it just struck me how some of the key arguments have just become kind of basic assumptions of the work that so many of us do. And certainly one of those is this idea of tropes of equivalence. And as I was reading, I go through and I see, where I very assiduously marked and underlined different parts of text and sometimes argued with the text, certainly during the dissertation and writing the first book. I came on this passage, which I'll just read the first couple of sentences from. You can see the little X's that I made on the side. So perhaps the thing to do is to go beyond the deconstructionist stage of trying to prove that equivalents do not exist and look instead into their manner of becoming. For it is the making of hypothetical equivalences that enables the modus operandi of translation and its politics. For instance, historically, when and how do equivalents or tropes of equivalence get established between languages? Is it possible that at certain levels of practice, some equivalents might cease to be mere illusions, and so on? And I just realized as I was, how much that had come to shape so much of the work that I've done. And so I just thought I would talk a little bit about my recent project and a couple of examples from it and how that might tie in to some of these questions. So my first book was on Linshu, and as I was finishing that book, I realized that one of my main arguments that I made in sort of pitching the book was wrong, which is that Linshu was a unique figure in world literature, that he was famously didn't know any foreign languages and became this very successful translator, without knowing any foreign languages, and a kind of so-called arch conservative who used his commercial success to push a set of kind of very traditionalist cultural values, which then provoked really unhinged responses from later generations of intellectuals. And I argued that this was something that was really unique. And as I was finishing the book, I realized this is not true at all. There are probably many similar figures. And one of them is Mustafa Luthiel Manfuluti, who is this famous Egyptian translator who famously, he did not translate nearly as many works as Linshu, but he knew no foreign languages, used a kind of traditionalist literary style, and provoked unhinged kind of attacks on his character from later generations of intellectuals, and also happened to die in the same year as Linshu, also translated some of the same works. And so I've recently have an article that just came out in PMLA, actually just appeared this week in the online version, that looks at the parallels between these two writers' careers. And it's a part of a larger project that examines parallels and points of intersection between Chinese and Arabic literatures from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century. And I'm very interested in this question of equivalences of institutions of culture, particularly the idea of high literature, of literary forms and literary language. And what I see, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, is that for intellectuals in Beijing, Cairo, Shanghai, and Beirut that often grappled with problems that were very similar, strikingly similar. It's the question of whether the written language could transmit modern knowledge, the pressure to reconcile classical learning with so-called modern or understood as Western thought, the role of traditionally educated people in new institutions, and the authority granted to those who could import or translate writings from abroad. And so in this piece, I look at, in particular, the translation of Paul in Virginia by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, which circulated very widely in the late 18th, early 19th century, translated into multiple world languages. And both were, of course, translated by Lin Shu and his collaborators, and then by Manfuluti. And I examine how these translations reflect on the transformation of key categories of Chinese and Arabic literary cultures. So we have terms, of course, in Chinese, such as wenxue and xiaoshuo, so literature and fiction, and the way that they appear in these translations, and as well terms like adab, or literature, and riwaya, or the novel or fiction in Arabic, and their relationship to debates about ideas of the reading public and the idea of the modern intellectual. And one of my ultimate goals in this project, and I think we see this particularly in the introduction to translingual practice, is this kind of question of East-West literary studies. And it's something I think really vexes the introduction. And of course, at any so-called area studies field or study of a non-Western literature is always grappling with this problem of the way that the humanities are structured around this categorization of the West and the rest, right? The way that an area studies field can only become visible in its relationship to the metropolitan West. And so what I'm trying to do, I certainly know that we cannot wish away this way of thinking or these kinds of categories, but I hope that this kind of study might help us to think around that problem in a new way. I'm also interested in communities of Sino-Muslims, including Majian, who Tamara just talked about, who spent time in Arabic-speaking countries in the 1930s and 1940s, and through their work, thought through the question of language reform in particular, and its relationship to ideas about cultural reform, modernization, and so on and so forth. One example of this is I have an arrow there. This is Ma Junwu, who is a figure I've been studying, who was born in Yunnan and spent several years in Cairo, and then later spent out the rest of his life in Malaysia, or Singapore, and then Malaysia, and translated one of the most famous narrative works in modern Arabic literature is Taha Hussein's The Days into Chinese in the 1940s. And I won't go into too much detail here because I know we're getting toward the break. But what I find so interesting about this particular translation is that Ma Junwu was really trying to think through the problem of commensurability between Chinese and Arabic at this moment of different points of language reform. He talks quite a bit about the problem of Taha Hussein's language, right? Taha was a ardent partisan of what we now call kind of classical Arabic or modern standard Arabic or Fusha, right? The most kind of elegant literary style. And Ma Junwu reflects on this problem of translating that kind of language into a version of modern Chinese that is consistent with the values of New Culture and May 4th movements, and sort of thinks a little bit about the points of commensurability and incommensurability between these two works. And again, I think it's this kind of work and the publications of writers like Ma Junwu and his colleagues who published both in Chinese and Arabic, they provide a valuable historical and theoretical resource for our own scholarly practice at a time when methodological approaches that try to go beyond the boundaries of national languages and literatures, whether that's world literature, or if we think of the World Republic of Letters, or arguments about planetary modernisms, all of these approaches often easily default to approaches that are essentially monolingual or limited in range to hegemonic European languages. And I think that this set of writers and thinkers and the kind of materials that they produced across Chinese and Arabic might provide a new way of considering some of these questions. So in all cases, I think my research and the story I tell here returns to this kind of question of tropes of equivalence and the ways that these writers and thinkers reflect on the transformation of Chinese and Arabic literatures at the end of the Qing and Ottoman empires. And I just want to thank Lydia and her work for showing the way for me and for so many of us.
So we are now at 3:31 p.m. and I think it's a good time to begin the second session, which I will be moderating. And we, for this batch, we are going to have Andrew Jones, Diang, Benjamin Kindler, Meng Liansu, and Shaden Tageldine, and Yuro Zhong. And we will start with Andrew, if that's okay. So just a quick introduction. Andrew F. Jones is the Louis B. Agassiz Professor in Chinese at the University of California, Berkeley, from where he also graduated with a PhD in 1997. He is the author of 4 books and many articles. Among his books, famously, is a trio of books on modern Chinese music, Like a Knife, Ideology and Genre in Contemporary Chinese Popular Music, Yellow Music, Media Culture and Colonial Modernity in the Chinese Jazz Age, and most recently, Circuit Listening, Chinese Popular Music in the Global 1960s, which just came out. And he also authored the book Developmental Fairy Tales, Evolutionary Thinking and Modern Chinese Culture. So take it away, Andrew.
Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure and a real honor to be here in such stellar company. It's quite intimidating, really, but it's nice to see a lot of old friends and faces today. So I know that Euro mentioned that we shouldn't think back or talk about the origins of the book, but in my case, she actually gave me a special remit to do so. I was instructed to talk about the appendices because I had a part in putting them together as a research assistant for Professor Liu way back when in the old East Asian Library in Durant Hall on the Berkeley campus. And I was really honored to be able to do so, to work on those appendices and to have a role in kind of doing some of the research and some of the data processing, going back to data again, that was involved in putting them together. And at the time, I would say that I was actually quite surprised as a fledgling graduate student that the 7 appendices for the book were actually turning out to be longer than many of the chapters. And I wondered to myself at the time, are these appendices too long or too supplemental or too extra? And I think looking back on them now, and I think they've been mentioned a number of times already by other speakers and presenters today, they're of course neither too long nor too supplemental nor too extra, but in fact, I would say that they're one of the most radical and interestingly experimental aspects of translingual practice, and one that I think that all of us feel are really kind of essential to the theoretical and the historical contribution of the book all these years later on. So what I mean by radical or experimental, I feel like the appendices, in contradistinction to the other chapters, experiment with a different kind of narrative mode and a different way to talk about Anatoly's presentation of organizing information, right, and conveying information and rendering data more theoretically interesting and more pointed in its argumentative thrust. In some ways, I would almost want to think of the appendices as being Arcade's project-like. There's something a little bit Benjaminian about them because they compile a lot of information, some of it related thematically, some of it related historically, some of it related in terms of motives or different linguistic categories. But that information in and across these appendices, really each word within those long lists of loanwords, reverse loanwords, etc. There's several different categories. Each of them somehow then come to stand in for, or to speak of, or to act as a trace of a larger matrix of for various narratives about Chinese modernity. And each word actually in some ways can be slotted into or can speak beyond itself towards very complex interactions in terms of colonial history, of technological histories, in terms of administrative histories, military histories, legal histories, histories of material culture, all of which inhere in the intensely complex kind of conflict of power and interests but also of various different kinds of new relationships and new commensurabilities that are established in the period between, well, probably starting in the 1600s, maybe 1500s onwards, with the presence of Portugal in East Asia, in Macau, and going on until the early 20th century. And so in this kind of series of lists or series of appendices, you start to see also emerging philosophical and literary transactions between China, its peripheries, Japan, Europe, the United States, and various other kinds of imperial formations. And interestingly, it's also not just a kind of synchronic list of the age of imperialism, but also one that gives us a really fascinating notion of diachronic renegotiations that are carried out linguistically between various sedimented presents and the accumulated linguistic resources of the past. In that sense, it's also grammatological in Yurou's, in the sense that Yurou uses in her recent work. So in the process of assisting Lydia with the research, I consulted a lot of sources, many of which she pointed me towards. This was not original research on my part at all, but that would include former scholars of loanwords and the history of loanwords in Chinese linguistic circles, people like Wang Li, previous classical usages. So there was a lot of trolling, scrolling through and consulting of Hanyu Dacidian and other classical materials and precedents, but also interestingly old textbooks and old dictionaries where you find equivalences being made and equivalences being set up. One of the things that personally quite fascinated me about this process is I began to realize in the process of looking at loanwords and studying loanwords, or even place names as they developed in modern Chinese out of the kind of commercial transactions, missionary relationships, and other sorts of actual maritime traffic, that the entire process of compiling the appendices actually had a really phonetic or phonemic or sound sound-based component to it, right? Because sometimes you look at a word and you can't really figure out in what way it's a transliteration of some other word in some other language. And what you have to realize is not only that there's a cacophony of other languages, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Russian, we could go on, Tagalog, whatever it was, but also a cacophony of Chinese or Sinitic languages. So one of the things that fascinated me in the process is I started to realize how deeply important Cantonese in particular, and also Minnan, had been as kind of languages of mediation between the two. And in reading through these lists and compiling these lists, I really had a kind of sonic sense of Babel, of cacophony, of linguistic transactions that were taking place, not between a standardized Mandarin that we now know and often take for granted, but a very, very different and much more fractured and regionally diverse landscape of languages, both within the Chinese-speaking world and also within the sort of domain of world history and colonial history. So I think it was a really generative process for me. And also I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of unpacking these various linguistic transactions and histories. And I look forward to reading more and seeing more being generated out of that, especially in terms of a lot of the work that many of you have been talking about today, South-South relationships, various very interesting resonances between, say, Sanskrit and Chinese, Arabic and Chinese, or say, Portuguese and Chinese. We could go on. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I hope I can yield back some of my time so we can get back on the correct schedule for today, is also, I think, about the formal innovativeness of these appendices and how they're extremely useful for something that not many people have addressed yet, pedagogy, teaching, and especially teaching undergraduates. When I teach translingual practice to undergraduates, I actually teach the appendix and not the written chapters, but there's a reason for that. The reason is that the appendices have a certain kind of gravity and a weight, a fullness that is a product of its length, but also of the kind of the power of lists, right? The power of lists to make a rhetorical point and to convey the sheer plenitude of the kinds of translingual practices that gave rise to modern Chinese. So for me, I found over the years that one of the best ways to understand or allow students, especially undergraduate students, to understand the historicity, the contingency, and the constructedness of modern Chinese is to show them these lists and have them work through these lists. And I think it gives them almost a physical shock sometimes to realize the extent to which the language in which they grew up. Many of my students at Cal speak Chinese as a first language. That's quite typical, maybe 80% of them, 85% of them. So for them, it's actually a very palpable shock because they realize the way in which so many of the words that they took for granted are grounded and rooted in a history of colonial interaction and transaction, and that these things were never natural. They came out of histories of struggle, conflict, and processes of capital transaction and of migration and of changing media. So it's really, really useful to use these appendices as a kind of battering ram to kind of do away with a lot of taken for grantedness with respect to language, how language works and how language relates to history, and especially colonial history and national history. In fact, I sometimes ask them, and it's a rhetorical exercise, but an interesting one nonetheless, that could you speak Chinese without the words in the appendices? And what they realize is that without those words, they would actually enter into a state of kind of aphasia. They would have 视语真, they'd be unable to speak their own native, taken for granted language. And I think this is a really palpable way, both for students to understand the historicity of language, but also, and this is really where the tendentiousness of the exercise comes in handy, to really more deeply and palpably and viscerally understand the predicament and the incalculable struggles that were faced by modern Chinese intellectuals, starting in the late Qing and into the early Republican period, who were also facing a state of what I can figuratively refer to as aphasia, of a loss of language. Given that kind of loss of language, or the loss of the taken for grantedness of language, they also then arose with a new language or with a new kind of linguistic creativity, which is really the font or the headwaters for modern Chinese literature itself. So I think the appendices in that sense have been extremely useful and generative, and have given my students at least, and I'm sure many of your students, a really deep appreciation and a much more palpable appreciation for how writers like Lu Xun and others invented a new language and attempted to remake the world by way of new words. So thank you, everyone. And it's been a pleasure to be here. And I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's presentations.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. We will swiftly move to our next presenter, Diang. Diang studied with Lydia at the University of Michigan. She has been teaching at Reed College since 2006. Her first book, Found in Translation, New People in 20th Century Chinese Science Fiction, is forthcoming from AAS Columbia University Press in 2021. With support from this year's ACLS Pauline Yu Fellowship in Chinese and Comparative Literature, she's currently working on a new book project tentatively titled The World Embedded in Modern Chinese Literary Imagination. So, Diang, the floor is yours.
Myself. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Gal. Thank you, Yuro and Professor Anatoly for organizing this wonderful event to celebrate Lydia and her work. I must start out with an apology because I missed the part of the instruction to talk about how Lydia's work has shaped and inspired and shaped our own research, which it certainly did and profoundly did in my own case, but my talk is going to be focused on teaching. And so on that note, it actually follows Andrew's presentation, the last part of his presentation rather well. I have 3 copies of Translingual Practice, one for use in my office, another at home, and a 3rd clean copy for making PDFs. This is probably nothing out of the ordinary for someone teaching modern Chinese literature at a small liberal arts college. I did feel, however, a little surprised when I spotted a copy in a colleague's office on her neatly arranged bookshelf. This is a professor who routinely teaches courses on micro and macroeconomics, and occasionally teaches courses on economic development of Asian countries. I guess I wouldn't have felt surprised at all if she were a professor of anthropology or history. Nonetheless, it was a very good surprise. Telling my colleague that Lydia was my advisor at Michigan in the conversation that followed made me feel that I was basking in reflected glory. Over the years of teaching, I have found myself returning over and over again to Lydia's book, either to assign specific chapters to students. I haven't dared to assign the appendix yet, or to sharpen up my own preparation through immersing myself in Lydia's way of thinking and writing. It is through reading and rereading this book that the magnitude of Lydia's scholarly achievement in terms of both methodological and theoretical breakthroughs became gradually and abundantly clear to me. I realized that back then in my graduate school years, I did not fully understand the astounding brilliance of Lydia's mind and work beyond a feeling of admiration and awe. Teaching in today's environment comes with its own challenges and privileges. Our students are increasingly aware and wary of the danger of sweeping generalizations or essentializing tendencies. At the same time, they might also jump too quickly to conclusions or rejections. Here I share one anecdote from an advanced Chinese class I taught some time ago. We were reading an essay by Wang Anyi on Shanghairen, and one student took issue with the presumptuousness of a writer to discourse on such a topic. Without some kind of carefully designed survey and rigorous statistical analysis, he asked, how can one make any confident observations about the people of a region of them being this way or that? I was both taken aback and mildly amused by his faith in surveys and statistics. I also immediately sensed similar challenges in teaching other texts we love, such as Zhang Ailin's 洋人看京戏,到底是上海人, and last but certainly not the least, Lu Xun's RQ 正传. Episodes like this make me realize that a forgetting of the discursive history of the past, as well as its potency in the present, is a very real threat. And part of our job, as Lydia puts so simply, is to resist that amnesia. To teach the true story of RQ, one cannot bypass the myth of national character, whose European origin, global trajectory, and profound lasting impact on the birth and subsequent development of modern Chinese literature were all brought into illuminating clarity by Lydia in her chapter, Translating National Character. This chapter exemplifies Lydia's simultaneous engagement with both issues at the macro level and the minutest of textual details. Reading this chapter has always been a mind-opening experience for my students. It makes them realize to what extent this story by Lu Xun is truly a product of translingual practice, with all of the attendant politics, ambiguities, and creative maneuvers. At the same time, the chapter also models for them a most inspired and perceptive close reading. Lydia's juxtaposition of Smith's anecdotal tale of the execution of the Chinese magistrate in his robes of office with the scene of RQ being forced into a white vest of foreign cloth for his final parade never fails to inspire. Translating a national character also exemplifies the expansiveness and rigor of Lydia's critical imagination. She asks big questions and fills big gaps in our knowledge. In an age when cross-cultural interpretation between East and West becomes more, not less important, Lydia's translingual practice, published 25 years ago, was both prescient and paradigm shifting. She was skeptical about dismissing the East-West binary simply on the grounds of its fictitious nature, and equally skeptical about reducing the agency of non-Western cultures to a single possibility of resistance. In reframing the relationship between the original works and their translations as a transaction between guest language and host language, Lydia decenters the discursive power of Western texts and denies them a signature of authenticity. This is her words, perhaps also airs of superiority. Throughout her work, Lydia persistently calls our attention to questions unasked, let alone answered, by various critiques of Orientalism, racism, and post-colonial studies. When I saw a recent title on world literature, Forget English, I was reminded of Lydia said 25 years ago, quote, "But we must not forget that there are vast areas in this world where metropolitan European languages are not spoken or have not succeeded in competing with native languages and acquiring the status of national language or dialect. What does the experience of those people and those places tell us about history, agency, hegemony, modernity, and subjectivity?" And I think we continue to grapple with this question. On a more personal note, and I'm wrapping up, I want to take this opportunity to thank Lydia again for supervising my dissertation and seeing me through the finishing line. Lydia came to Michigan when my dissertation committee practically evaporated. One professor retired, another moved on to greener pastures, a third one was forced out. Lydia saved me from falling through institutional cracks into a fate of 不了了之. One thing that Lydia taught me, which I try to relate to my own students, is to always ask questions that are not only interesting to us individually, but also worth asking for many. One of my students, who went on to study for his master's degree at Nanjing University and is currently a doctoral student at Harvard University working on Republican era Chinese poetry, thanked me when he was praised for having good 问题意识. But it is really to Lydia that he owes his thanks. Lydia continued to be a great mentor for me after I graduated from Michigan, helping me get published, land a job, and get involved in various academic activities. I missed the days when we had parties in her house, located in a bucolic part of Ann Arbor, where we made dumplings, enjoyed baked yams, and just talked in a generally very relaxed atmosphere. I'll always remember one anecdote told by Li Tuo 老师 about the theft of the entire manuscript of translingual practice from the trunk of Lydia's car shortly before it was about to go into print. While the thief's eye for scholarly treasure is certainly incredible, we are all most fortunate that the incident of the purloined manuscript didn't prevent the book from entering the world and changing forever our way of looking at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will quickly be moving to Benjamin Kindler. Ben Kindler is a PhD student at Columbia, studying under Lydia Liu supervision. He is currently preparing a PhD project on the relationship between labor and culture from the 1920s up to the early socialist period, in which he tracks the reconfiguration of cultural production as itself a form of creative labor via the figure of the communication worker, together with the aestheticization of material labor and the working class body through radical cultural production. Ben.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers as well as to Professor Liu. So in these comments, I'm going to ignore one of the bits of advice that Professor Liu most frequently emphasizes in her pedagogy, which is to avoid the fetishization of words. In rereading Translingual practice for this forum, I couldn't help but be on the lookout for repeated turns of phrase, especially with a view towards her cultural work, her scholarly work since the publication of Translingual practice. And so as a leaping off point here, I want to take up one such turn of phrase that repeats throughout the book and hopefully in doing so not lapse wholly into fetishism. So in the opening chapter, Professor Liu repeatedly alludes to that process of interactions between Chinese and other languages as a unidirectional process. Now, this notion of direction, as deployed in the chapter, has an explicitly spatial direction, and one that's closely related to her understanding of questions of coloniality that inform the entire book, as well as, of course, its successor, clash of empires. Namely, that the vast and persistent restructuring of the Chinese language itself across syntax, vocabulary, and even the finer details of pronouns, and correspondingly what it meant to write in Chinese, took place as a result of a sustained series of encounters with other languages, ones enabled through the mediation of translation, and a process, crucially, she writes, that resulted in no corresponding syntactical shifts on the part of languages such as English. Now, I want to take up this notion of the unidirectional here and suggest that however much Lydia might frame it on her pages as in spatial terms, we would in fact also do well to emphasize its more temporal dimensions, so that in coming to speak of these unidirectional encounters, we can understand a wholesale transformation of temporalities as such, as a result of which it ceased to be possible to imagine any pure or originary Chinese language to which one might return. So too, I think, are we able to understand that difference between modern forms of translingual practice that emerged from the mid-19th century onwards and previous moments of translation, in that the latter, however important as they indeed were for the constitution of, for example, Buddhist thought in China, did not have, for Liu, the same restructuring effects as did the translingual practices of a later historical moment. Now, attending to the temporal aspects of Liu's argument, I think, allows us to repose the question of the modern, as in her well-known and often cited formulation, translated modernity. The notion of a wholesale transformation in the temporalities of language and writing allows us, I would argue, to recognize that Liu's treatment of modernity is precisely not that of mid-1990s post-colonial studies, with its commitment to the irreducible specificity of alternative modernities or the repressed modernities, as expressed in another book, or indeed frequent investment in ideas of cultural difference. Rather, it marks for Liu the extent to which the Chinese language and writing of the 20th century arises from and participates in that set of epistemic and temporal shifts that characterize modernity as such, in all their violence, namely the reconstitution of lived experiences and historical rhythms at every level according to a new future-orientated temporal configuration, a process then of which the reconfiguration of the Chinese language was both a consequence and a premise. And I think it's the same sensibility that informs much of Professor Liu's senior undergraduate course, which I think many of us would have taught, China in the Modern World. I've always felt that the title of this course is important. Not China and the Modern World, as if China was somehow outside of modernity, but in. because the horizon of modernity always encompasses China, and to speak of modern China requires us to speak of the world. For me then, modernity is itself one of the key conceptual categories of the book in ways that remain revelatory. And yet the question of what world and even of what modernity was of course never reducible to the particular modes of imperial violence that shaped China's incorporation into modernity from the mid-19th century onwards. Professor Liu's close readings of specific texts showed that the question of the modern or of the new was one that was constantly contested and had to be constantly re-articulated, re-performed. A singular modernity, to borrow the term of Frederick Jameson, it remained, and yet a modernity in which different claims were made, a modernity always up for grabs. It's in these terms, I think, that we're led to pay attention to the intimations that the book offers of claims of modernity beyond its specific time span. The book, after all, ends in the mid-1930s. When I first read the book, I thought that it was curiously silent on the matter of the socialist period. Oddly so, perhaps, because the cultural productions of the socialist period also transformed the Chinese language in ways no less radical than the period preceding it. But I realize now that this was not the case, and that much of the book's importance also derives from its relation to the particular intellectual context of mainland China, as well as the United States in the mid-1990s. The complex socialist claims on modernity that emerged in China after 1949, and which possess their own orientation towards temporality and futurity, are present in the book, albeit often in spectral form. The moving coda that Professor Liu offers of that Beijing taxi driver, that good reader of literature, Professor Liu notes. The multiple references to Ohua, the Europeanized content of much of Mayforth writing, a term that no one who studies revolutionary Chinese literature can read without thinking of Chu Choubai and his own visions of a revitalized proletarian vernacular. And particularly relevant to my own work, and we heard some of this just now, that desire to resist amnesia and an enforced process of forgetting that constitutes, Professor Liu says, the desire of the book at the end of the introduction, a point to which I'll also return. Yet at the most concrete level, I was struck by the passing note that Professor Liu leaves at the end of her chapter on the literary compilations of the 1930s, when she writes in relation to an abortive compilation of China's place in world literature, that possibility of making a statement on the relation of Chinese literature to the world did not emerge, quote, at least not for many years to come. Yet come it did. And I think it's not too much of a leap to detect in that aside, on that last line of one of the later chapters of the book Translingual Practice, intimations of Professor Liu's current work on questions of world literature during the socialist period, above all that of the Tashkent Conference of 1958. At that historical juncture, translingual practice took on a significance quite different from that in the first half of the 20th century, producing new visions of political community, intervening in ongoing national liberation struggles, and producing even new conceptions of the writing subject, the Afro-Asian writer. Nor, in light of what I said earlier, is it a coincidence, I think, that the article that evidences these current research concerns on the eventfulness of translation poses temporality as one of its central categories. Indeed, the very formulation of eventfulness, I would suggest, poses translation as something happening in time, but also intervening in time, potentially posing new temporalities of politics, new ways of imagining the world. That resistance to amnesia that Professor Liu evokes in translingual practice as the desire animating the book seems to me to be just as pertinent to her current work on Tashkent and its associated legacies as moments and times at which the future of the world remained more open than it is now. Resisting amnesia, I take it, means restoring the possibility of a historical and even a temporal consciousness, not as a messianic leap into the past in Benjaminian fashion, but as the basis for maintaining the openness of the future and avoiding a facile presentism. It means keeping the question of the modern and of the world open and the future unwritten. This has, as well as being very closely relevant to my scholarship, also been a guiding desire behind my own teaching, as I've just finished a course introducing students to the hopes and visions of Asian revolutions in the 20th century. And it's above all for that resistance to amnesia, the refusal to forget or the refusal to bid farewell, be it to revolution or to visions of future politics, that I'm deeply grateful for Professor Liu's work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you for keeping within the time limit. Our next speaker is Lian-Su Meng. Lian-Su is an associate professor of Chinese at the University of Connecticut. She has published articles on eco-feminist poetics, eco-poetics, transnational poetics, and translation in modern and contemporary Chinese poetry. Her monograph, titled Man, Woman, Machine, Nature, Modern Chinese Poetry at the Intersection of Industrialism and Feminism, 1915 to 1980, is forthcoming with the University of Michigan Press. Thank you, Liansu.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Yuro, Anatoly, and Gal for organizing this workshop in celebration of Professor Liu's translingual practice. It is both exciting and nerve-wracking to connect and reconnect with so many friends and mentors and colleagues in the field in such a format. As I think back at my path since my first meeting with Professor Liu in 2002, and reading translingual practice in her seminar on modern Chinese literature at the University of Michigan, I'm amazed by how much my views of life and scholarship have changed, thanks to Professor Liu, and how much my current research is still firmly grounded in the fundamental ideas in her groundbreaking book. Before meeting Professor Liu as a first-year graduate student, I had lived my life in China, ostrich style, buried my head deep in literature, mostly Western, some in English, some translated into Chinese. My views on literature and translation were purist, simplistic, and universalist. Literature, translated or not, provided timeless parallel universes that allowed escape from life. It was a source of wise thoughts wrapped in carefully chosen words. It has nothing to do with theory, politics, or history. Thinking back, I could not be more grateful for Professor Liu's patience and thoughtful guidance as I struggled with the radically different views on literature, translation, theory, politics, and history in her book. As she writes, quote, "A cross-cultural study must examine its own condition of possibility, constituted as a translingual act itself. It enters rather than sits above the dynamic history of the relationship between words, concepts, categories, and discourses. One way of unraveling the relationship is to engage rigorously with these words, concepts, categories, and discourses beyond the realm of common sense, dictionary definition, and even historical linguistics," unquote. It was a challenging process for me to shake off the patchwork of ideas I weaved together over the years from common sense, dictionary definitions, and books I read indiscriminately, and enter rather than sit above the dynamic history of the relationship between words and ideas. Professor Liu radically questioned the conventional paradigm of translation and the hierarchical relation between the original and the translation by drawing attention to the, quote, contingencies, struggles, and surprising twists and turns of events at each moment of confrontation between China, Japan, and the West at the site of translation, or wherever the languages happen to meet, unquote. And by foregrounding the creative agency of Chinese intellectuals as they actively translated, distorted, adapted, and appropriated Western literature and discourses for their own purposes. Professor Liu's reconceptualization of translation as a translingual practice of dynamic processes of meaning making in a historical context, and her emphasis of the creative agency of Chinese writers and intellectuals as they closely engaged with Western works and ideas now form the foundation of my current research. My hopefully forthcoming monograph titled Man, Woman, Machine, Nature, Modern Chinese Poetry at the Intersection of Industrialism and Feminism, 1915 to 1980, examines the important interplay of industrialism and feminism in Chinese literary imagination through an eco-feminist study of modern Chinese poetry from the 1910s to the 1980s. When Western notions of women's liberation and gender equality were first introduced into China at the turn of the 20th century, they were often regarded as symbols of modern Western civilizations and used to gauge China's progress, together with other Western parameters, such as science and technology. Feminist ideals have often occupied prominent positions along with industrial progressivism in literary, cultural, and political imagination of Chinese modernity across the 20th century. The complex entwinement of industrialism and feminism was among the most enduring themes in the literary imagination of Chinese poets, writers, and artists. Chinese poetry, a literary genre rooted in millennia of male-dominated cultural tradition, yet critical in the popularization of such notions as progress and equality in China, saw particularly intense and complex engagement with these modern discourses. By looking closely at critical moments in the life and poetics of a handful of important Chinese poets over the course of the 20th century, I examine how their poetic imaginations and understandings of Chinese modernity were shaped by the multifaceted challenges of their personal engagement with modern industrial technologies and feminist thoughts. Through the 20th century, Chinese poets' fierce translingual, transcultural, transnational engagement with the intricate tapestry of wide-ranging ideas and ideals often echo, converge, and intersect with discussions and debates in the predominantly Euro-American fields of ecofeminism and eco-criticism today, without purporting to be so, but frequently yield different insights because of the unique set of challenges they experienced. My book draws on methodologies from literary, historical, and gender studies, as well as theoretical insights from ecofeminism and eco-criticism to develop a new approach to critical environmental and gender studies in modern China in a translingual and transcultural context. As Professor Liu states in the beginning of her translingual practice, quote, "The true object of my theoretical interest is the legitimization of the modern and the West in Chinese literary discourse, as well as the ambivalence of Chinese agency in these mediated processes of legitimation," unquote. Her book has certainly achieved this object, as it has paved the way for generations of scholars to question widely held notions and break new grounds in unraveling the complex experiences of modernity in China's contact and collision with the West, and the Chinese intellectuals' creative agency in this dynamic process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lian-Su. We will be moving on to Shadon Tageldine's presentation. Shadon is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota, focusing on 19th and 20th century literatures in English, Arabic, and French. Tageldine's research and teaching engage empire and post-colonial studies, critical translation theory, trans-African and trans-Asian studies, the historiography of literary and cultural renaissances, among many other topics. Her first book, Disarming Words, Empire and the Seductions of Translation in Egypt, was awarded the honorable mention for the 2013 Harry Levine Prize of the American Comparative Literature Association. Thank you, Shadon.
Thank you very much, Gal, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Gal, Anatoly, and Euro for organizing this wonderful conference symposium. I'm deeply honored to be in the company of everybody here. It is a real pleasure. And it is a particular pleasure to celebrate the transformative impact that Lydia has had, that Lydia Liu's work has had on my scholarship, as it has had on that of so many others in the room. I will say, briefly that I recall with fondness is kind of burned into my memory. My first meeting with Lydia, I think also around 22 years ago at Berkeley, in my second year of graduate school, I believe, in a seminar that really proved foundational and transformational for my thinking. And of course, I was also privileged to have Lydia as the co-director of my co-advisor of my dissertation. So it is truly a pleasure to be here today and to reflect on a work that appeared not long before I began my graduate work at Berkeley and this journey. So to begin here, in her groundbreaking study, Translingual Practice, whose 25th anniversary we are gathered here today to celebrate, Lydia Liu critiques the tendency to privilege, and I quote, European languages in accounts of East-West linguistic transactions and to leave the unspoken part of that history/story unaddressed, end of quote. Yet she also cautions that merely attending to non-European languages is not enough, if only resistance is what we hear when we listen. And I quote, in my own study of translingual practice, Lydia writes, I argue that a non-European language does not automatically constitute a site of resistance to European languages. Rather, I see it as a much neglected area where complex processes of domination, resistance, and appropriation can be observed and interpreted, end of quote. Indeed, she goes on to insist that we confront, and I quote, the possibility that a non-European host language may violate, displace, and usurp the authority of the guest language in the process of translation, as well as be transformed by it or be in complicity with it, end of quote. Lydia's acute understanding of non-European languages as complex force fields in which much more than resistance is at work, even in contexts in which those languages stand in relations of unequal geopolitical power vis-a-vis their European counterparts, has been a leitmotif in my research, certainly in my first book, Disarming Words, Empire and the Seductions of Translation in Egypt, and now in my book in progress, Toward a Transcontinental Theory of Modern Comparative Literature. In my current book, as I read across 18th through early 20th century Arabic, French, and English discourses to define what makes the comparison of literatures thinkable in the modern period, the language proper to literary modernity is a fraught site of translational invention. As Lydia might argue, such a site is not one in which the meanings of comparison are decided in European languages alone, but rather in the traffic between those languages and a host of non-European languages like Arabic. The case in point on which I will just touch today is a pioneering comparative study of French and Arabic literatures, arguably one of the first such systematic works in modern Arabic, written by the Ottoman Palestinian intellectual Muhammad Ruhi al-Khalidi. Al-Khalidi penned his study, تاريخ علم الأدب عند الفرنج والعرب, وفيكتور هوغو, History of the Science or Discipline, can be translated variously, of literature among the French and the Arabs, and Victor Hugo, in the city of Bordeaux, where from 1898 to 1908, he served as Consul General of the Ottoman Empire. In Cairo, the book was first serialized between 1902 and 1904, partially serialized, then published in monograph form in 1904, and finally under Al-Khalidi's name, because originally it was unsigned, in 1912. Championing natural language, its author argued for something of a revolution in Arabic letters, a revolution I would suggest that is also a return, at once a movement toward the new and a reinvention, not just a resurrection, but kind of reinvention or recasting of the old. In a provocative new French language preface dated 1906 and intercalated in the 1912 Arabic edition, Al-Khalidi rejects a pre-modern Arabic prose style he identifies with what he calls the vain luxury of useless words, end of quote. Better, he says, and I quote, to be clear, precise, and accessible to the mass of semi-literates emerging from schools from an Orient organized on the European model, end of quote. The intent of his study, he declared, was to show readers of Arabic what a properly modern literature looks like by introducing them to what he called French literature, or what he spoke of as French literature in particular, and European and world literatures in general. And by doing so in a transparent idiom that ideologically refracted the turn to nature and post-Enlightenment European literatures, where Romanticism, realism, and naturalism variously flirted with empiricism's tender and hard. In a modern world in which empiricism and empire traveled together, he suggests, language could no longer afford to revel in itself, to exist for language's sake. It had to point clearly and precisely to life, to a certain species of the real. I read Tarikh, al-Khaledi's work, as testimony to the continuity in death, what I think of as a continuity in death, that the 19th century Arab Nakhta, variously translated, as some of you know, as Renaissance, awakening, revival, induces in literary Arabic. Al-Khaledi describes a civilized, modern literature as one premised on clear language. To that end, he denounces, as we have seen in just the glimmering of text I've cited, the rhyme and rhetorical gymnastics that had overtaken post-classical Arabic prose, and calls on Arabic to approximate the sensibility, if you will, of the languages of modern Europe. In so doing, he alienates modern Arabic language and literature from the sonic and semantic play and interplay of their past. Many a speaker of Arabic, Firiel Ghazul, suggests once imagined the language incomparable. As the language of the Quran, it incarnated the inimitability of the word of God. As the language of a revered poetic tradition, it was without rhetorical parallel. So there's sort of sacred and secular faces of this notion of problematic, obviously, notion of incomparability. Al-Khaledi, I argue, ultimately suggests that literary Arabic cannot be modern without becoming comparable to French and to other arbiters of linguistic modernity, arguing that, and I quote, eloquence is not particular to Arabic alone. He maintains that such eloquence now inheres in a modern potential common to all languages, to make words mirror worlds, to transact, and I quote, the exact correspondence of word to meaning in every dimension, whether the word is in formal, grammatically inflected Arabic, in grammatically uninflected Arabic, or foreign, end of quote. Yet this becoming comparable is no simple break with the imagined incomparability of Arabic. Insofar as the Quran, for example, is for Al-Khaledi emblematic of the natural language and critical spirit vital to literary political modernity, one argument he makes in his text, the Quran retains some measure of incomparability as a touchstone, if you will, for modernity. Further, in representing certain strands of pre-modern Arabic poetry and Arab Islamic thought, those he imagines in tune with the lucidity of Quranic style, as precursors of the modernity of European languages and literatures, Al-Khaledi similarly accords a certain pride of place to Arabic expression of a secular stripe beyond the Quranic. I would suggest then that Al-Khaledi threads modern literary comparability through the logic of Arabic's past incomparability, sacred and secular. And I use these terms advisedly. Yet in relocating the Quran to the realm of literature, adab, in its modern dispensation, and thus to the philological folds of literary history and criticism, he also moves the sacred text from incomparability to a zone of comparability. If other texts are held to its measure, so too is it measured against other texts. This fate also greets Arabic letters more generally. For Al-Khaledi ultimately positions modern Europe, embodied in the figure of Victor Hugo, as the measure by which literary value is to now be selected from the Arab Islamic past and retained in the Arab Islamic present. Staging semiotic transparency as that which underwrites the equality and fraternity of signs, their utterers, and their receivers, Al-Khaledi affirms Hugo's conviction that poetry lies in ideas, not forms. He declared, writes Al-Khaledi, and I quote, that all words are equal, end quote. If in modernity all words are equal, no word superior to any other except insofar as it more clearly captures meaning, as it more exactly fits meaning, Small wonder that the Quran becomes a text among texts. Indeed, in Al-Khaledi's reappraisal, the Quran is assigned value on new terms, consonant with Hugo's accent on ideas. It is now prized because it preaches a poetics that calls on poets to walk their talk. After all, as Al-Khaledi reminds his readers, the critique that the Quran levels against poets in one of its verses, thereby defining the truth value of its idiom against theirs, against the idiom of poets, is that many poets, quote, say what they do not do, end quote. In other words, they are all talk and no walk. The equivalence of word, meaning, and deed that the Quran enjoins then, which is something of a moral sort of argument about language and deed, marks for Al-Khaledi the best of what Arabic letters once were. To the extent that the literature of 19th century Europe approximates nature, meaning what it says and making meaning transparent to the common reader, such as what Arabic letters once more should be. Hugo thus incarnates the lost nature to which Arabic letters must return if they are to rediscover their modernity. In this regime of literary comparability, words must be cut to the measure of their meaning. The level word equal to its meaning, the political equal of all others, and equally available to all its receivers, defines a sensibility proper to the modern republic of letters for Al-Khaledi. Here, the different expressive traditions of the world can be read on equal footing as literature, and the different literatures of the world made commensurable, hence more comparable. Al-Khaledi's history thus times literary comparativism to the measures of modernity, to whose standard different languages and modes of poesis and different epistemologies henceforth must be calibrated. At stake in such comparison are ends poetic and political. The equivalence not only of Arabic to other languages and literatures, but also of Arab-Islamic empires, the Ottoman Empire in particular being, of course, his proximate context, to their European rivals, a resetting of the balance of world powers, soft and hard, such that these forces are in equilibrium. In its translation between Arab-Islamic and French epistemologies, the language of modern Arabic literature is born. And that translation, as Lydia H's translingual practice so clearly shows us, does not unfold between pre-given equivalents. Rather, it is a process that, and I quote from Lydia's work here, creates tropes of equivalence in the middle zone of interlinear translation between the host and the guest languages, which, I quote again, becomes the very ground for change, a change that cannot be reduced to an essentialist understanding of modernity, for that which is untraditional is not necessarily Western, and that which is called modern is not necessarily un-Chinese, end of quote, nor, I would say, un-Arabic. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaden. And to conclude this section, I am happy to present Yuro Zhong. Yuro is an associate professor in the Department of East Asian Studies in University of Toronto. She researches modern Chinese literature and culture, writing systems and literacy, intersections between technology and writing, history of linguistic thought, and media theory. Her first book, which just came out, is titled, well, actually, it's been a year already, Chinese Grammatology, Script Revolution and Literary Modernity, 1916 to 1958. Came out with Columbia University Press in November 2019. So I'm happy to present Yuro, and please go at your time.
Unmute. Thank you very much. I will talk fast. Hopefully we will be still on schedule. So
it's okay. It's okay. Don't talk that fast. I think it's fine. We're only about 5-10 minute max behind, and it's okay.
Thank you, Chair of our panel. Right. So We thank you, and we're completely humbled by not only Professor Liu's scholarship, but also your presence making this possible. I'll dive right in. My biggest takeaway of translingual practice can be summed up in one sentence. This one sentence is not exactly written verbatim in translingual practice, but Professor Liu has been known to iterate that more than once. Modern Chinese literature is comparative literature. And to echo Andrew, one prime example and about teaching translingual practice using the appendix is this particular entry, the very concept of literature. As Appendix A of translingual practice on page 273, that the Chinese term 文学 made to connote literature is in fact the Japanese word bungaku, a neologism first made to equal literature in Jesuit translations in the 17th century. Such translingual practices were not only at the core of what later came to be known as modern Chinese literature, but also the very condition that enabled the making of a national literature. At a more basic and material level, modern Chinese writing, the script of Chinese characters, experienced a similar influx of foreign influences, enacted a parallel process of self-invention, and beckoned and still beckons the kind of theoretical scrutiny in order to truly understand the encounter of the alphabetic and non-alphabetic words and worlds. To borrow Lydia Liu's more recent formulation, scripts in motion, my work has been focused on scripts in crisis, in revolution, and in critical reflection. The result of my work, is this humble little green book, Chinese Grammatology, Script Revolution and Literary Modernity, 1916 to 58. And advance apologies to those who already know all too well about the work and who has spent time reading, critiquing, helping me making this a better book. Sorry. I begin with a dramatic discursive transition at the turn of the 20th century when a national treasure, that is Chinese characters, came to be regarded as a national liability, launching a script revolution that aimed to eliminate Chinese characters and implement a Chinese alphabet. To the surprise of many, not only did the script revolution take place, but also it lasted for almost half a century, reached an unprecedented scale, and became one of the biggest linguistic and grammatological experiments in human history. As the Chinese script became increasingly seen as a roadblock to literacy, democracy, and science, hardly any self-respecting intellectual at the time questioned the necessity of alphabetizing the Chinese script. One document that I show often is this particular public letter dated to December 1935, signed by 688 leading Chinese intellectuals, script revolutionaries advocating for an alphabetic Chinese, including Cai Yuanpei, Li Gongpu, Sun Ke, Liu Yazi, Mao Dun, Guo Moruo, Ba Jing, Ye Shengtao, Tao Xingzhi, and of course, Lu Xun. In tracing the rise of phonocentrism in modern Chinese writing, the systemic privileging of speech over writing, Chinese grammatology develops along three trajectories. First, there is the script revolution itself, its provenance, transmutations, and containment, which sought to reinvent millennia-old Chinese writing. Second, the attempted sea change of the Chinese script conditioned the emergence and development of modern Chinese literature and language, giving rise to what may be understood as a double revolution of both script and literature. Third, as a representative of non-alphabetic writing systems undergoing script reforms, the Chinese script ended up reconfiguring the basis of grammatology, the science of writing, as well as its politics in the short 20th century. Two global moments bookend the modern Chinese script revolution 1916 and 1958. These 2 years neatly correlate the domination of phonocentrism at the turn of the 20th century and the emergence of Chinese grammatology in the age of decolonization and national form around the mid-20th century. The year 1916 marked the dominance of phonocentrism, which saw not only the posthumous publication of Saussure's course in general linguistics, but also Zhao Yuanren, the future father of modern Chinese linguistics, first English article titled The Problem of the Chinese Language, sweeping away all objections to alphabetizing Chinese. Two major alphabetization movements followed. First, the Chinese Romanization movement, spearheaded by a group of Chinese and international scholars and quickly endorsed by the Chinese nationalist government in the 1920s. Second, the dissident Chinese Latinization movement, initiated in the Soviet Union and championed later by the Chinese Communist Party in the 1930s. If Zhao belonged to a global phenomenon which saw the rise of linguistics and the decline of philology, the Chinese script revolution was part and parcel of the global story of phonocentrism. In fact, it coincided with script reforms in many parts of the world, of the Egyptian Arabic script, the Ottoman Turkish Arabic Persian script, the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, the Vietnamese Chungnam, and the Japanese Kana system, to name a few. The global success of phonocentrism was largely due to what I have termed phonocentric antinomies. In the case of the Chinese script revolution, the allegiance to phonocentrism reduced the Chinese script to an inadequate technology for transcribing speech sound, stripping it of any civilizational value and exacting indisputable violence against Chinese culture, philosophy, and epistemology in general. At the same time, such epistemic violence was registered as a necessary evil because of its modernizing and revolutionizing tendencies. More than a bearer of national language and literature, the new alphabetic Chinese, with its perceived accessibility and superiority in speech transcription, symbolized to the underprivileged, marginalized, and repressed the possibility of speaking in their own voices and writing in a new alphabetic script, and provided grammatological footing to the larger 20th century projects of democracy, liberation, and revolution. As the script revolution wore on, it was the antinomies of phonocentrism that permitted its various transmutations until it no longer resembled the original model of Roman Latin alphabet. The good faith of the progressive side of phonocentrism would inevitably outweigh its ethnocentric and identitarian violence, gave room to the generative intertwining of the double revolution of script and literature. It is by way of these phonocentric antinomies and from within the phonocentric regime that this book makes sense of the containment of the Chinese script revolution. The year 1958 was at the same time the climax and abrupt ending of the socialist script reform, when the first premier of the People's Republic of China, Zhou Enlai, announced that the current tasks of the script reform consisted of character simplification, Putonghua promotion, and pinyin implementation, conspicuously leaving out the institution of the Chinese alphabet. The final and surprising containment of the Chinese script revolution coincided with a global moment involving decolonization, anti-imperialism, and international solidarity in the immediate wake of World War II. In the final years of the Chinese script revolution the final years of this revolution coincided with what Tamara just mentioned, the monumental Bandung Conference in 1955, which laid the groundwork for the non-aligned movement. The Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference in Cairo soon followed in 1957, and in 1958, the Afro-Asian Writers Conference was held in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, launching intellectual exchanges across the two camps of the Cold War for the next 2 decades. Calling resistance to colonial and imperial mode of world domination, this second moment of Chinese script revolution also announced the untenability of the phonocentric regime and its attempt to steamroll all non-Roman Latin writings of the world. It encouraged the national form as an anti-ethnocentric ethnocentrism, sorry, that's a mouthful, that is, as an ethnocentric antidote to and containment to Western ethnocentrism. One particular approach that recalibrated the Chinese ideophonographs, what the Chinese paleographer Tang Lan called composite script, 综合文字, surfaced as a potential candidate for the national form of the Chinese alphabet. Recognizing the revolutionary pulsations of phonocentrism while resisting its epistemological violence, this at once millennia-old and freshly modern national form enabled a grammatological critique from within the phonocentric order. In strict accordance to the definition of dialectics, phonocentrism gives rise to a Chinese grammatology. Fully aware of its Chinese ethnocentrism, this grammatology constitutes a critique of the Western ethnocentrism that predates Derrida's of grammatology. This Chinese grammatology also plays a part in making the argument for the non-identitarian politics at a global moment of decolonization, anti-imperialism, and international solidarity. The Chinese script emotion, fueled by phonocentrism and its antinomies, comes in full circle and culminates in the promise of a Chinese grammatology. So with that, I thank Lydia for her constant inspiration and for the simple lesson that if you take writing seriously, you will make discoveries. Thank you.
Let's get started on our final session. I'm Anatoly Detweiler. I'll be the moderator. And we'll just dive right in to our final presentation, which is being given by Ari Heinrich. My pleasure to introduce Ari. Is a professor in the School of Culture, History and Language at Australian National University. He has published extensively in several wide-ranging fields, including visual culture, history of science and medicine, and queer theory. And he is the author of two indispensable books, The Afterlife of Images, Translating the Pathological Body Between China and the West, and Chinese Surplus, Biopolitical Aesthetics and the Medically Commodified Body, both published by Duke. So without further ado, Ari, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief so we can get right away to Lydia. I think I'll talk for fewer than 5 minutes. But I wanted to start by thanking the organizers for giving us this chance. It's a really sweet opportunity, for lack of a better word, to get together and celebrate our mentor and the fruitful ongoing afterlife of translingual practice. And I also appreciate your allowance for the time difference here, giving me this placement, so thank you. Mainly, I wanted to say that in thinking about the 25th anniversary of translingual practice, one thing I wanted to reflect on, like other people have today, is just the book's incredible and enduring relevance. So many things can happen in a quarter century, and so many things have happened in this quarter century. And these are things that we might reasonably expect to change the way we understand the legacy of a great work. So I mean things like the usual suspects, enormous transformations in technology, in medicine, in communication, in environment, the big stuff. So what strikes me in reflecting back on 25 years of translingual practice is just that. In many ways, the work is as relevant now as it was when it was first published, if not more so, especially in plague times. There's a lot to think about when we consider how quickly, how seemingly spontaneously anti-Chinese and anti-Muslim sentiment and its associated vocabularies re-emerge in popular speech and culture as soon as trouble arises. While Australia has done pretty well so far in terms of managing COVID from a public health perspective, for example, one area where it's fallen far short has been in outreach to non-English speaking and minority communities at the beginning of the pandemic, especially. In July and August of this year, bureaucrats from the Department of Home Affairs used Google Translate to produce health announcements on its COVID-19 website and Twitter feed. Targeted at so-called multicultural communities, these materials were posted without consulting professional translators or community leaders. When confronted about it, the department said it used Google Translate at the time to, quote, ensure there was an easy-to-use repository of translated information available to multicultural communities as quickly as possible, end quote. Needless to say, the results were not great. In one case, a Victorian government poster about wearing masks was written half in Arabic and half in Farsi. In another case, an otherwise simple message, which was supposed to be where to find information in your language, was rendered nonsensical in Chinese as 用您的语言供的信息. I can barely even put it together, but that's what it was. All this while these same communities were being vilified and falsely held accountable for the virus itself. So with that in mind, let me just list, in the power of lists that was mentioned earlier, list 3 things that 25 years on stand out for me about translingual practice, and that in my view have contributed directly to its longevity as a text. The first thing is just that the book speaks to so many different fields and disciplines. Of course, it's got special relevance for Chinese and Sinophone studies related fields, but this is a book that pioneered, and dare I say, it even gave us a kind of a language for describing the complexities of cultural exchange around the translated word that older discussions of commensurability were not equipped to handle. In that vein, the second thing I'd say here is about translingual practice is that the book is still a critical resource when we face what feels like the constantly recurring existential question of the humanities, of how we justify our own existence in neoliberal university environments, of how we seem to have to prove time and again how it is not enough just to learn a handful of words to communicate, but rather that we must think and think hard about whom we are exchanging language with, especially as new technologies and new vocabularies emerge. Finally, then, and with the Australian example of using Google Translate during COVID in mind, something that stands out for me 25 years after the publication of Lydia's groundbreaking monograph that I think has also contributed to its longevity is that it provides critical counterbalance to the prevailing hyper-literalism of bureaucratic language and the false convenience of machine translation. Lydia's book reminds us that translation is more than words, and that more often than not, what we understand as source and target languages are mutually constitutive, if they exist at all. Taking things a step further, yet I'd go so far as to say that an ongoing gift of Lydia's work has been to show readers yet another aspect of our mutual entanglement, and thus to contribute to the possibility that we can find ways to understand each other. Maybe this reading is too utopian of me, but in dark times, it's a message I think we really need. And I'm grateful to have tools like translingual practice to work with in the classroom and beyond. I'll wrap up my remarks there, and thank you again for including me in this conversation.
Great, thank you so much for your profound remarks and reflections. So now we're moving into the final portion of the event where Professor Lydia will offer her remarks. This is not exactly a formal keynote address or anything, but she'll discuss things, and then we'll have perhaps a question and answer session afterward. As Yuro mentioned in the chat box, if you have questions that you would like to direct either to Professor Liu or to any of the presenters who have spoken before, please just type them out in the chat box, and then we'll sort them out and kind of filter them as needed. So at the outset, Yuro gave a very comprehensive introduction to who Lydia Liu is, so she really doesn't need any further introduction here by me. I'll just give you the very basics, that she is the professor of literature at Columbia in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and the director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. And she is the author of Translingual Practice, the reason why we are gathered here today. So without further ado, Professor Lydia Liu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm speechless. As Ari just mentioned, a quarter century. Yes, I just quarter century seems like a long time. And one measure of it is that some of my former students have kids that are either finishing college or starting college. I feel the shock of it when I try to reflect on my 30 years teaching career in the abstract. But when I see all of you and hear you speak, and of course, there are many of you who are in the audience, students and colleagues. So when I'm with you, the past and the present do seem to converge to deliver a powerful moment of reunion and solidarity. The last couple of hours I have spent with you means a lot to me. It's really wonderful together in the virtual space with my former students from, well, UC Berkeley, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and my current doctoral students from Columbia. It's a tremendously moving experience for me and a learning experience. I've taken notes. I'm gonna reach out to each of you about your questions and your incredible research that I'm learning about. And I am overwhelmed by what you said with such generosity and warmth of feeling. And I'm very much moved by the experience of just being together with you across the many time zones that divide us. And in spite of all the setbacks and sufferings that we all have had to endure in 2020. And very soon, I think I will have taught the same length of time at Columbia as I had done at Berkeley. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to help me reflect on my own intellectual path and growth over the past 3 decades. It's of course not news that the world itself has undergone profound changes over the past quarter century. And many of you have gone on and become accomplished scholars and leaders of the field, as your presentations have just demonstrated. And your work is taking us in exciting new directions. I'm very proud of what you have achieved and what the next generations of scholars will achieve. And I'm greatly honored by your presence and by all of you who came today. Thank you, Uro, Gal, and Anatoly for organizing this event, for actually coming up with the idea of a Zoom event. And in fact, today's meeting gave me some ideas about what this group could do in the future. But in any case, I really am very grateful for the time you put into the organizing of this event, with the support of your home institutions, of course. The University of Toronto, McGill University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The beautiful poster we have all seen was designed by Tao Unreich. I love it. It's for its simplicity and elegance. my gratitude also goes to my department and Weatherhead East Asian Institute. They have supported me all along, not only on this occasion, but on numerous other occasions. Thank you. What a team. I feel that I owe it to you, both to the speakers, wonderful speakers, and to the audience, to say a few words about the distances I have traveled since the publication of my first book. By the way, I did lose a copy of the manuscript. And not only that, we had a big fire in Oakland Hills. I almost lost my computer disk. And that did not happen. So you see the perils of these creations. One just can't take it for granted. But it's here. I didn't completely lose it. And as you know, a lot of things have happened between translingual practice and the Freudian robot. If I were to identify one thread that runs throughout my work, that is my obsession with the philosophical problem, how to grapple with the strange in the familiar, and not so much truth or untruth, epistemology or knowledge, but the uncanny or the doppelganger that poses a fundamental challenge to what we take as the boundaries of self and other. These boundaries are often recognized not as boundaries, but as differences, unities, or identities in our day-to-day engagement with the world. And when you scale them up and let them dominate your planetary thinking in the manner of the meridian lines that began more than 500 years ago, these boundaries actually recede from view to become the invisible ground for the legibility of linguistic differences, racial differences, cultural divides, irreconcilable worldviews, and even civilizational clashes that repeatedly justify imperial world-taking. I, as you know, remain deeply suspicious of these claims and have tried to show in my work how the act of translation is capable of both producing such unities and differences and identities, and at the same time troubling them by transgressing those boundaries. So it's in the generalized movement of translingual practices where I first glimpsed the possibility of ontological instability, multiplicity, diversity, change, and the ceaseless transformation of things. Those of you who have read Clash of Empires may recall that I introduced an analytical method to work with what I call the super sign. I treat the super sign as a pivot of translingual analysis and associated with the image of linguistic monstrosity. And the example with which you are familiar is this unit called E/barbarian. And this is to demonstrate in exact terms why translation matters to international politics. Now, as you can see, the supersign is not a word belonging either to Chinese or to English. It is a crossbreed, fantastic crossbreed of translated concepts. It's signifying Ching. It actually hides behind the wordness of a concept and articulates the concept without itself being articulated in any tangible form. In the supersign, we encounter a monstrous doubling of the barbarian and the sovereign subject. This analytical method has helped me cast aside the traditional preoccupation with translatables and untranslatables, so we can better concentrate on things like camouflage, traces of the foreign in the familiar, enchanted meanings, disavowed forms of translingual movement of concepts. Now, it's been a long afternoon, so I'm going to just give you a quick report on what I have been working on, what I am working on now. Over the past several years, I have been working on a new book called Wittgenstein in the Machine. It's such a privilege and honor to present this work, however briefly, to this audience, and I have never presented it elsewhere. It's the first time I'm presenting this new work. And in this research, I'm trying to tackle the problem of word concept entanglement, a big challenge for me for many years. And I tried to do this through a sustained engagement with Wittgenstein's philosophy. One of the chapters is forthcoming in Critical Inquiry, probably if they are not delayed. It's scheduled to appear in spring 2021, that is in a few months, but I think they're probably backlogged. This is in this chapter, I present some of my new research on the early post-war moments of AI philosophy. Please be aware that I'm not jumping to another field. I know this, people probably see this happening in my work, and there are connections that when you get a chance to read the work. And some obvious connections with my last book, The Freudian Robot, but also other connections. What I can say now, just to for the sake of time, is that the central figure in my story is one of Wittgenstein's students, who became a pioneering figure in the post-war development of computational linguistics and AI philosophy. A feminist philosopher named Margaret Masterman, who created Cambridge Language Research Unit in the UK. Her work anticipated French philosopher Jacques Derrida's critique of Western logocentrism or phonocentrism. And she published her work in the 50s, so well, a decade in advance of, more than a decade in advance of Derrida's work. And her work entails a repudiation of the unity of word and concept, extremely ambitious and important work. And her philosophical repudiation, in my view, was done in a more thoroughgoing manner than does Derrida's critique of logocentrism. Imagine a Wittgensteinian language game being played on the computer. And you get the idea of what takes Masterman and her team to build a machine that is capable of handling fraught relationship of word and concept in language. The task that she and her team posed to themselves was this. Would the machine, or can the machine, measure up to the ambiguity and multiplicity of word meanings, cross-references, analogies, and so on? And this is related to what we think about a lot of the claims that people have been making about artificial intelligence. I try to think of her work, some of the central aspect of her work, as a dialogue with the ideographic principle of the zi. In fact, she built the zi into the earliest computable thesaurus, interlingual semantic networks in machine translation. To test the limits of the concept of word as it's entangled with the concept of concept. So she relied on the ideographic principle of the zi to build her machine. This is really something that people don't pay attention to. I was puzzled why her work has not received the attention among philosophers of language, even scholars of Wittgenstein. I could only think of two reasons. One, she was a woman philosopher. And two, she relied on philosophical resources outside the West. So she went really way beyond Derrida. And this is not just her reiteration of Wittgenstein's language game. She was trying, and her team, of course, to build a machine that would compete with the grammatical principle of Chomsky at MIT. And so what interests me here is to what extent this ideographic principle of the zi animated her philosophy and helped her place Wittgenstein in the machine. And reading her work, I came to the conclusion that she actually created a post-Wittgensteinian philosophy. And many of you might not be familiar with her name, but if you were in the field of artificial intelligence, you will recognize her not as a philosopher, but as a pioneer in machine learning. And a lot of the algorithms she and her team built at Cambridge led to the development of very sophisticated technologies of automated information retrieval, machine translation. They were using a very different model, and this was the statistical model that would be done after the 90s. Until then, most people relied on the syntactical model. Masterman and her team pioneered in a very different model of translation, and they created computer computer programs that laid the foundation of AI machine learning. In fact, one of her disciples' algorithms was the one that was adopted by Google's search engine. And the Google search engine would not have been possible without their work. So I'm just showing this since we don't have anyone from that field. Her name would not ring a bell. However, I'm trying to show in my new work that maybe we could discover the strange in the familiar, both for the field of language philosophy and for the field of AI machine learning. I think this is my very brief report on my current work. Thank you so much, and would love to get your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this exciting preview, which you gave us access to. So it's really a privilege to see the thought process before we read it in publication. So, right. Now we'll open the floor for people who have questions. We have ostensibly 12 minutes left, but if it's a lively discussion, I'm sure we could go a little longer, but please do raise questions that you have now. Thank you. Or since, okay, well, I was gonna say, since the chat box is apparently a very quiet place and maybe intimidating, I would actually welcome people to ask directly, but Professor Michel Hawks has asked a question here. He says, congratulations, Lydia, on the anniversary of your wonderful book and on training such amazing students. Coming back to translingual practice, how do you think the development of databases of Republican era material has changed the study of that period?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for joining us. I thought Anatoly would be the best person to answer this question. Anatoly?
Sure. Well, it's changed the kind of work that we do because we no longer have to read everything. We have to know what we don't know in order to search, use a search function, which is not possible before the creation of databases. So I think that's really opened up the way that we do our work, but then it also reshapes the kind of work that we do, oftentimes actually in a direction against which Professor Liu cautions, that is to say the fetishization of words in the form of kind of keywords, keyword searching, and so on, right? It's becoming easier and easier to do this, this kind of search for a word and then create a history of it, or to kind of create a dialogue around that keyword through full text databases. I mean, databases nowadays have are rapidly moving beyond page images and into underlying digital text, which makes this all the more possible. So that's my initial answer. But this impulse to create a database can be traced back to the Republican itself, and also the project of preservation and canonization, which is an important chapter in translingual practice. On Zhao Jiabi's role in the 中国新文学大系, one of my favorite chapters. That's what I would say. Lydia, I would ask you to add things if you see fit.
Yes, I think absolutely that if I were to compile the appendixes now, it would have been less work. I mean, the database would be extremely helpful. Currently, in my present research, I have been looking at the problem of keywords. I take the unpopular view about Raymond Williams' work, the conflation of word and concept, and that's I'm interested in the entanglement. If we use the database simply to search for words, yes, now we have access to so much. However, the conceptual aspect of it, if we equate words with concepts, then we're doomed, because we cannot carry on our analytical work. And this is precisely what Anatoly has demonstrated with his historiography of even history writing itself, and to what extent it was subjected to that process. And turns out it didn't start now. It started back then to somehow rely on these the data to do intellectual work. And then I think there's there are some traps in terms of how we work with primary sources when these sources are presented through the databases to us as being available than what is not available. I see there more questions.
Yeah, so just briefly on this topic, Andrew Jones has recommended an issue of representations from a couple of years back, which discusses the search and how it's changed research in the humanities. Looks like Professor Schaden-Tagelden's question actually builds upon this issue of word concept and search. So she writes, "It is truly a privilege to learn of your latest work. How might Margaret Masterman's repudiation of the unity of word and concept help us understand the unhinging or the estrangement of familiar words from their associated concepts? that permits signifiers from different signifying chains, as you've argued in Clash of Empires, to recombine in charged supersigns. In other words, does Masterman's work illuminate new ways of understanding the operations of power in coupling and uncoupling languages in translingual practice?
Thank you, Sheldon. Great question. Well, this is what I've been I'm working on. Exactly, where is the place of the political in this work? There are scholars of science who would point to the funding situation. For instance, they received funding from the government, from the US Defense Department, for example. So that's one way of looking at the political. And there's also other ways of looking at how she navigates through competing claims about language and the historical baggages that come with these claims, and also numbers, the place of number in my own understanding of the problem. The question of the 字, that is the written character, does not have to be just writing. It is also, it's 文字 and 数字, that is writing and numerals. The 字 is the place where you can generalize the movement of the sign. So I see different levels of engagement. At one level, they might be in contradiction. At one level of this competition, this race to create machine translation, US and UK, and how they work together and how they contest each other's philosophical understandings of language and writing. And there's also the philosophical thinking, also very much contested as to what extent number, the question of number can be brought into the problem of translation. For them, the place of number is key, and they had to figure out to what extent that the number would articulate to writing. I did some of that work in the Freudian robot. That was a very different kind of a setting, because one thing that I often asked myself was that can we not exclude number from the problem of translation? And if you read the Blue Book from Wittgenstein, he would then, it's very interesting, Wittgenstein, he asked many strange questions which appeal to me very much. That is, for instance, he would say, while contesting Turing, Alan Turing, who was taking his class at Cambridge University, Turing was would later come up with a very important groundbreaking article on the machine and the computable numbers and all of that. Can machines think? This is the question. Then Wittgenstein would say, can a machine have toothache? So basically, this is a very strange question. Can a machine have toothache? He's not taking this problem of artificial intelligence in the direction of affect studies. And that's not the direction he's going. He's showing that when you ask whether machines think, you're practically asking, can numbers have color? Okay, and so he's saying perhaps our conceptualization in language itself is already entangled with the philosophical problem. And this is how he talked to Turin. And so if you go back to Turin's classic essay, Turin parodies Wittgenstein's critique of his work using a Wittgensteinian questioning method. So it's a very interesting problem here. So what I'm saying is, at one level, you're looking at a historical a moment, very early moment of machine translation, artificial intelligence, because machine translation was what gave machine learning its original, its most powerful algorithms. It came from machine translation, okay? Many of these projects failed. As some of you know, many of these early machine translation projects failed for good reason. I'm not gonna go into that. But then, can you do philosophy in the machine? So that is what an interesting question that Masterman raises, aside from what Wittgenstein did. So I think we're looking at multiple aspects of this problem. So I'm not yet bringing the supersign into this research because right now my obsession is the entanglement of word and concept and what those machine learning engineers have done with it. I think that's very interesting. They have done some very interesting work with, I see as breakthroughs that will prevent us from equating a word with a concept, that which we do as humanists all the time. So I'm working through this problem here. This is a problem that bugs me all the time. I think it dates back to the barbarian, that, you know, how come one could fetishize a word and taking its meaning as coming from somewhere?
Great, thank you. I see another question in the chat, but before we turn to it, actually, I want to change course and give Professor Chen Li from Toronto a chance to reiterate his question from earlier in the day about the possibility of thinking of sentimental imperialism in kind of the context of translingual practice, but I don't want to put words into his mouth. Professor Chen, do you want to resubmit your question just orally, if you're here?
Yep. Thank you very much, Anatoly. And also, actually, probably I can ask Professor Liu later about that. That might be a a question that takes more time than what we have. But I did just submit a question, which I think is easier to talk more briefly if Professor Liu is in the mood to talk more about that. Basically, it's about the process, reversed process of translingual practice from Chinese into other kinds of languages. Kind of the opposite, if I understood your first book correctly, the other kinds of translingual practice. So I don't know whether there are, from your perspective, based on especially your subsequent works, do you think there's any substantial need for either adjusting some of the conceptual frameworks or the assumptions we have developed from your first book when we are studying the kind of reversed process of translingual practice from Chinese language sources into other, for example, European language sources, European language texts, including the English and other European language translation of, for example, Da Qing Lui Li, into different language, but also I think other scholars have studied the kind of the translation from Chinese texts into European language about literature and medical treatises and so on. So if you want to talk about this at all, I would certainly personally would very much like to hear from you whether there are any substantial adjustments that researchers needed to make when studying a very different kind of power dynamics as well as a very different kind of translingual process and practice.
Thank you.
Thank you. The answer is yes, you could. I think many of you are already doing this work, right? In your own research projects, taking, I'm not saying that the idea from, I mean, you are doing we are collectively doing this work, trying to think clearly about what is happening in any particular moment in your own work, for example, the Dating Li translation, that kind of international politics and legal discourse, and how that went back and changed the British discourse, legal discourse. And so there's always this process. Now, I would be, I also heard your earlier question about affect, emotional, like a sentimental aspect. That is a very interesting question, because if you remember my analysis of the super sign, where I was looking at a certain level of paranoia, the British paranoia, and they wanted to be loved, and there's this question of love, and there are other scholars have done this work, and Chardin's own book, just with seduction, you don't want to be rejected by the people you rule, right? So you need to develop a emotional attachment. Imperial power is not simply brute force. There are very important psychic investments in these processes, and therefore, yes, I'm with you. There are all these interesting things that are going on. We don't normally write about them because it's not easy to capture them. Maybe Chardin could comment on it. She managed to capture them in her book about translation precisely as a process of seduction.
Thank you for sharing your very interesting work with us. I joined late. My apologies if you have addressed this earlier. I am wondering if your current research is also delving into AI, reproduction and translation of art, and exploitation of artists, and the intervention of the legal community into the question of intellectual property rights.
Great question. This particular work delves more into language for philosophy than art. I think Ari's work actually goes in this direction. And Ari, your new book centers on this.
It's still a work in progress coming together, but yeah, trying to think about visual languages and inevitably how those intersect with political economics in who gets to exhibit, how they get to exhibit. And not to pass the buck, but I also think David Bourgonjon, wherever he got to, is also really well positioned to speak to these types of issues. That powerful, the cultural node of the idea of translation is itself translatable in so many useful ways. So yeah, I think there's something to be said about the mutual constitution of what art means across all of the various artificial borders that we have now. So vague answer, but
great, thank you. So rounding the bend here, but still kind of on the question of power, I think. I want to turn to Yuro's question, who asks, this might be a superficial question, but how would you compare your excavation of He Yinzhen to your rediscovery of Masterman? Why do feminist thinkers inevitably need rediscovery? What does it take for female thinkers to really speak in their own voices and write their own words?
Great question. That was also my question. In fact, one member of Masterman's team, who then became extremely important in computational linguistics, once made a remark, which I put in as the epigram of my essay, which is, computing is too important to be left to men. So why did she say that? Oh, yes, definitely, most definitely, this is related to the work that Dorothy Cole, Rebecca Carr, and I did when we excavated and translated He Yinzhen, trying to make her text extremely important intellectual engagement with anarchism and socialism available in the English-speaking world. I think, why is it that feminist thinkers always need rediscovery? What does it take for these thinkers to speak in their own voices and write their own words? In the case of He Yinzhen, she edited a journal, which many historians later would attribute to her husband, Liu Shipei. So you see what happens. In the case of Masterman, it's interesting that the field of AI research acknowledged her as a pioneer. There was no way they could get around her. However, in the field of philosophy, in the humanities, nobody recognizes her work. I'm just curious to see, also echoing your question, how many more such feminist philosophers can be made visible. It's not that they didn't exist or they didn't speak in their voice. Sometimes they were not simply defending a feminist cause. They were making scientific contributions, and how come they're just simply written off? And I'm thinking of creating a seminar with a colleague or two from Columbia's computer science department. And perhaps we will address this issue if we get the chance to create such a course. Women scientists, it is a big issue. So why am I getting into that problem? But I think I'm taken by my research to this. I was astonished that such an important philosopher who was not only a pioneer in artificial intelligence research, but also a radical thinker who tried to push the limits of logocentrism, and who relied on this concept of the zi to resolve the entanglement of word and concept. Such an important thinker will have things to contribute to our ongoing discussion of AI philosophy.